Margaery Tyrell stood in the dimly lit solar of the Red Keep, the flickering glow from the torches casting dancing shadows against the cold stone walls. The city below buzzed with life. King's Landing, a sprawling hub of secrets and power. Just yesterday, the news had spread like wildfire. Margaery Tyrell was to marry King Joffrey Baratheon, first of his name, to secure the alliance between House Tyrell and the Iron Throne. But Margaery, usually so calm, composed, and willing to play the game, found herself overwhelmed by a sense of foreboding she could not shake. A voice deep within her heart insisted that this union would be a grotesque farce. Joffrey was not just a boy king with little patience. He was cruel in ways that made her blood run cold. She had seen him at the tournament after the Battle of the Blackwater, arrogant, sneering, lashing out. She'd spoken to his former betrothed, Sansa Stark, in hushed, coded whispers during a feast, gleaning hints of the suffering Sansa had endured under Joffrey's sadistic temper. And Margaery, though she was trained since girlhood in the arts of courtesy and the nuances of power, felt an uncharacteristic swirl of fury burn inside her. House Tyrell had long stood for chivalry, magnificence, and the flower of courtly love. There was nothing chivalrous about Joffrey. He was a weed choking the sun, and she realized with mounting dread that wedding him was a gamble not just for her own life, but for the soul of her entire house. That night, as she stood alone in the solar, she rehearsed the words in her mind, the words she would speak to her grandmother, Olenna Tyrell, the next morning. It was one thing to confide doubts to her cunning grandmother, another thing entirely to defy the carefully laid plans that had already been set in motion by Tywin Lannister and Mace Tyrell. She could almost hear Olenna's sharp voice. "Precious little fool, do you think we can just walk away from an arrangement with the Lannisters? They saved us at Blackwater Bay and we saved them in return. This is how alliances are forged." But Margaery also remembered how Olenna would sometimes soften, how she prized her grandchildren above all else, how she loathed foolishness and cruelty. And more than once, she had heard Olenna's withering remarks about Joffrey's disposition. Perhaps there was a chance to change their house's course before it was too late. Margaery made her decision sometime after midnight. Her heart hammered wildly as though an invisible hand pressed at her chest. She felt that if she tried to speak then, no one would hear her, and if she waited any longer, the moment of potential freedom would slip through her fingers. She stood by the tall, narrow window, peering out at the lights that dotted the city. She imagined the small folk below, bakers, blacksmiths, fishwives, oblivious to the intrigues swirling in the Red Keep, and she thought of what her marriage would mean to them. Joffrey was already hated by many. Any reason to question the legitimacy of the crown could spark unrest among the masses. And now, perhaps, the Tyrells would have to stand on a different side. The gravity of the choice weighed upon her. Yet the more she thought, the more convinced she became that she would not yield. At dawn, Margaery confronted her grandmother in a small private chamber in Maegor's Holdfast. Olenna sat in a high-backed chair, draped in her usual distinctive headdress, her sharp eyes scanning her granddaughter's face. Margaery did not mince words. She confessed her dread, her certainty that marrying Joffrey was a choice that would destroy her, degrade their house, and sow seeds of chaos that even their cunning might not overcome. Olenna's first reaction was predictable. A stinging rebuke, a reference to the precariousness of their position. But as Margaery persisted, as she described Joffrey's cruelty in detail gleaned from Sansa Stark's timid revelations and her own observations, Olenna's expression shifted from impatience to deep thought. The Queen of Thorns was no fool. She understood the high stakes, and she recognized the sense of doom in her granddaughter's eyes. Before noon that same day, Olenna asked for a private audience with Mace Tyrell, the Lord of Highgarden and father to Margaery. This conversation was more tempestuous. Mace prided himself on cunning in political maneuvers, but he was also a man easily swayed by vanity and the idea of his own grand designs. He wanted to see his daughter as queen, the Tyrell rose decorating the Iron Throne. He wanted the glory and the power that came with becoming the second most powerful man in Westeros. Olenna hammered him with a list of Joffrey's dreadful misdeeds, the stories from Sansa that were now echoed by Margaery. Mace was torn. He paced the chamber, occasionally wringing his hands, occasionally glaring at Olenna as though she were trying to steal his moment of triumph. Yet the picture they painted of Joffrey was one so foul that even Mace, with all his ambition, was forced to shudder. At last, he demanded time to think. House Tyrell could not simply walk away. They would lose face, lose the support of the throne, perhaps spark Tywin Lannister's wrath. But if their potential queen died at Joffrey's hand, or lived in daily terror, what good was their alliance? They had no illusions that the Lannisters would let this refusal pass with a casual shrug. The Lannisters had already begun reaping the benefits of the Tyrell alliance. Food supplies to the capital, generous loans, a buttress of legitimacy after the battered realm had seen so many kings come and go. If the Tyrells now backed out of the marriage, it would be nothing short of a public affront. Tywin Lannister was not a man to ignore such an insult. Moreover, House Tyrell risked being labeled as traitors. Traitors do not survive easily, especially when the realm was still reeling from war. But the Tyrells also had power. Highgarden, the fertile Mander Valley, immense wealth second only to House Lannister, legions of bannermen, and a seat so ancient and respected that any open conflict would not be quick or simple. Mace Tyrell recognized, as he left the meeting with Olenna, that the path forward might well be war. And war was not the outcome he wanted. Yet he could see in Olenna's eyes that the possibility was far from improbable. Margaery's official betrothal announcement was scheduled for the next evening, during a lavish feast in the Great Hall. The bells of the city tolled bright and clear on the day, as if to herald the joyous union. The corridors of the Red Keep bustled with lords and ladies dressed in their finest silks, the air humming with speculation and gossip. Margaery dressed in a gown of ivory and gold brocade, her hair arranged in exquisite curls piled upon her head, the signature Tyrell roses embroidered across her bodice. She appeared radiant, but a careful observer might have noted the stiffness in her shoulders, the tension around her mouth. She was about to commit an act that could very well destroy the fragile peace in the realm. The great hall was filled to capacity. King Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, half-slouching, eyes glittering with excitement at what he believed to be his final triumph. Next to him, Cersei Lannister wore a smug half-smile, occasionally letting her gaze flick toward Margaery with something akin to disdain and grudging respect. At Joffrey's side stood Tywin Lannister, stoic and grand in his lordly robes, outwardly calm but clearly exuding the authority that made him the true power behind the boy king. The Tyrell contingent included Mace, garbed in green and gold, as well as his sons, Loras and Garland, each of them draped in the proud colors of Highgarden. Olenna was seated in a place of honor, her sharp gaze flicking back and forth like a falcon surveying a field for prey. As the herald began the formal words of betrothal, speaking of unity and victory, praising the bravery of House Tyrell and the generosity of House Lannister, Margaery stood before the throne, her posture impeccable. But inside, her heart thundered. Her eyes flicked toward Sansa Stark, standing off to the side. Sansa looked pale, as though she barely dared to breathe. Margaery knew that once she spoke, the entire hall would be lit with the fury of 1,000 watchers. She recalled the look on Olenna's face earlier that day, a slight nod, as though giving her granddaughter the signal to act. Olenna understood that Margaery was the key to forging or breaking this alliance. She was trusting that her granddaughter would find the nerve to do the unthinkable, and that House Tyrell would stand behind her. Or, if they did not stand behind her, Margaery would be destroyed. There was no middle road. When the herald paused, inviting Margaery to step forward and confirm her acceptance of this betrothal, she drew in a deep breath. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath alongside her. King Joffrey's lips curled, expecting her sweet compliance. She met his blue eyes and felt a spike of loathing. Then she spoke, her voice clear, carrying easily through the hush. "Your Grace, my Lord Father, my Queen, I come here today to speak the truth of my heart." She paused, letting the tension build. "I must refuse." A gasp rippled through the assembled crowd. Some whispered in confusion. Some gaped, open-mouthed. Joffrey's face twisted from smugness to outrage. His cheeks reddened, and his eyes bulged. Tywin's gaze snapped sharply toward Margaery, then toward Olenna and Mace Tyrell. Cersei rose from her seat, her lips parted in wordless fury. The hall, once so silent, erupted in murmurs that escalated to shouts. Margaery remained still, feeling as though her entire body had turned to ice. She had done it. There was no turning back. King Joffrey's shrill voice cut through the noise. "What do you mean you refuse? You don't have that right. I am your king." His anger was so palpable that he nearly leapt from the throne. But Tywin placed a steadying hand on his grandson's shoulder. Even Tywin's calm facade showed cracks. His eyes were iron. He directed his question not to Margaery, but to Mace Tyrell. "My Lord of Highgarden, what is the meaning of this?" Mace took a step forward. His face was pale, and his neck glistened with sweat. He coughed once, searching for words that would not fully damn his house. "Your Grace, my daughter has expressed grave misgivings about this union. She fears for her safety." The words sounded small, meager in the giant hall, but they had the effect of a thunderbolt. The corners of Joffrey's mouth twitched. He bared his teeth in a furious scowl. The onlookers, the courtiers in the gallery, murmured in shock. Someone near the back let out a frightened moan, worried that Joffrey would order an immediate bloodbath. But Margaery's refusal had come in so public a setting, with so many witnesses, that even Joffrey could not easily command her seized and executed on the spot. The Tyrells, after all, had an entire retinue of guards in the hall, and their knights were among the best in the realm. Cersei spat the words, "This is treason. Treason against the crown." She advanced a step, golden hair swaying, her emerald eyes blazing with rancor. Olenna responded by rising from her seat, her chin held high, her voice crisp as she said, "If a child is threatened with harm by the one who would be her husband, is it treason to preserve her life, my queen?" Her rhetorical question dripped with subtle condemnation. A hush fell again as the tension in the great hall rose to suffocating levels. The Tyrell knights stood ready to defend their lady if a sword was drawn. The Lannister guards bristled. King Joffrey's fist shook on the hilt of a jeweled dagger at his belt, but Tywin's grip on his shoulder tightened. Tywin Lannister, his voice soft but lethal, said, "We will speak of this in private. Now." He flicked his gaze around the hall, an unmistakable signal for the onlookers to disperse, for the guards to usher out the lesser lords and ladies. The Tyrells, the Lannisters, and the key members of the small council retreated to a more private chamber behind the throne room. Though the sumptuous drapery and gold fittings might have evoked luxury on any normal day, the mood was anything but comfortable. Joffrey paced like a caged panther, eyes darting furiously. Cersei stood near him, glowering. Kevan Lannister loomed behind Tywin, quieter but no less grim. Pycelle hovered nervously, while Varys stayed in the shadows, his expression carefully neutral. Mace and Olenna faced them, with Margaery at Olenna's side and Loras standing slightly behind, one hand on the pommel of his sword. The tension was enough to make the air crackle. Tywin addressed the Tyrells. "I would have an explanation. We had an agreement. It was your house that approached us to forge this bond. We accepted. And now, at the moment of formality, you humiliate the king in front of the entire court." His voice was cold, carefully measured. Olenna inclined her head, her tone brittle. "My granddaughter has fears about Joffrey's temperament. The stories from Sansa Stark were not encouraging. We cannot, in good conscience, give our flower to a boy who plucks petals with a knife. Surely you understand a grandmother's concern." Her words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was barbed. To Tywin, they sounded like an accusation of monstrous cruelty from the House Lannister side. Joffrey snarled, "Those are lies. That little bird is a liar. I'll put her head on a spike next to the traitor Starks if she dares." He stopped short when Tywin gave him a silencing glance. Cersei's voice rose with indignation. "These are vile rumors. Joffrey is a dutiful king. He has done what is necessary to maintain order. If your daughter is too weak or squeamish to stand beside the king, that is her failing, not Joffrey's." But Olenna simply gave Cersei a pitying look. "We are not so easily fooled, my queen." She paused. "Indeed, if that is what you insist, perhaps we should revisit this arrangement entirely. Clearly, there is no trust here. It was an enormous gamble, speaking to the Lannisters in such a way. Olenna knew full well that Tywin could decide in a heartbeat to have them all arrested, might dispatch ravens calling their bannermen to muster, and so forth. But House Tyrell was equally formidable, and they were within the Red Keep with a sizable retinue. The conversation hung on a razor's edge. Margaery felt her palms dampen with sweat. She realized how easily this could end in bloodshed. She remembered Sansa Stark's hopeful, fearful eyes. She steeled herself. She had done this for a reason. She needed to see it through. Tywin said, "Is this a formal withdrawal? Or is this a negotiation to see how we might appease your concerns?" The dryness in his tone betrayed that he could see little middle ground. If the betrothal was broken, House Lannister would be humiliated, and Tywin Lannister was not a man who tolerated public humiliation. Mace Tyrell tried to find conciliatory words. "We have no desire to break faith with the Iron Throne, my lord. However, I ask you to see reason. If Joffrey would make a small gesture of good faith, show that my daughter would be safe." He trailed off, realizing the futility of the request. Joffrey was already glaring murderously at Margaery, a sneer twisting his young face. He refused to even pretend he might be gentle or contrite. From Margaery's vantage, it was plain that Joffrey believed he had absolute power, and the Tyrells had to bend or break. He had no intention of kneeling. Olenna, seeing the storm brewing, smoothly took up the thread. "But as I see, that is unlikely. So perhaps it is best that we remain in alliance through other means. We will continue to supply King's Landing with grain. We will stand against Stannis or any other pretender who dares threaten the throne. But Margaery, I fear, must not wed your grandson." That single statement settled the matter. It was a rejection so monumental that the entire room felt the tremor. Joffrey let out a half-incoherent snarl, lunging forward. Margaery flinched, but Loras was at her side in an instant, a hand on his sword. 2 Lannister guards stepped forward to block Loras. Tywin raised his voice, cutting through the tension. "That is enough." He turned to Olenna, his features set like granite. "Very well. You have chosen your path. Now hear me. You have insulted the crown, cast doubt on the king's good name, and done so before half the lords of the realm. You will regret this. If you withdraw Margaery in such a public manner, you forfeit all the privileges and boons we offered your house. Understand that our patience is not infinite." Olenna stared him down with all the regal bearing of a woman who had lived through more than one Targaryen's reign. "We shall see, Lord Tywin. We shall see." And with that, the Tyrells departed the chamber. It took all of Margaery's composure not to run, for she could feel Joffrey's rage burning holes into her back. The entire Tyrell party swept out of the Red Keep, returning to their hastily packed pavilions in the outer wards, and prepared to leave King's Landing under tight security. They had not even reached the city gates before the first wave of repercussions arrived. Lannister guards at the gate demanded they turn back, that they had no royal dispensation to depart the capital. But Loras Tyrell, with a cold glare, reminded the guards that the Tyrell party had come at the Lannisters' invitation, and if they now wished to hold them prisoner, it would be a hostage situation. The guards hesitated, knowing full well how dangerous it could be to provoke a pitched battle in the streets. Eventually, grudgingly, the gates opened. Riding at the head of the column, Mace Tyrell tried to maintain a dignified air, though inwardly he fumed at the insult and the risk. Olenna's carriage bore her and Margaery, the latter sitting with trembling hands hidden under her cloak. Olenna placed a comforting hand on her granddaughter's wrist. "My dear, we have stepped off the cliff. Now we must make sure we land on our feet." Once free of King's Landing, they made for Bitterbridge, a Tyrell stronghold. Along the way, they dispatched riders bearing messages to their bannermen throughout the Reach, alerting them of a potential conflict with the crown, preparing them for war if war should come. Night after night, they huddled around campfires, hearing rumors of Joffrey's rants, of Tywin's fury, of Lannister envoys racing north, east, and west. Every rumor painted a grim picture. Some said that Tywin would declare the Tyrells traitors. Others insisted that the king had demanded Margaery be brought back in chains to wed him. A few rumored that the Lannisters and their allies in the Crownlands were already gathering forces. The Tyrell leaders braced themselves for the worst. Back in King's Landing, Tywin indeed wasted no time. He summoned the small council, drilling them with orders to secure the loyalty of lords along the Rose Road and in the Stormlands. He sent a raven to Roose Bolton in the north, though that alliance was tenuous. He commanded that the gold in the city's coffers be carefully inventoried, bracing for a potential protracted campaign. The streets of the capital rumbled with rumors of the broken betrothal. Some of the small folk whispered that Margaery Tyrell was braver than they realized, daring to defy the monster on the throne. Others called the Tyrells fools for provoking the fury of the lion. Meanwhile, Joffrey's mood grew darker by the day. He demanded that Sansa Stark be punished for spreading the lies that contributed to Margaery's refusal, but Sansa had managed to flee the city with the aid of Peter Baelish shortly before the fiasco, heading for an uncertain refuge. So, Cersei raged, calling for the Tyrells' heads. But Tywin, in his measured way, decided that a full-blown civil war might be costly. He began exploring alternative alliances, perhaps forging a match with the Martells or seeking an alliance with the Iron Islands, though that was an unlikely bedfellow. War, if it came, would not be one the Lannisters entered lightly, but neither would they shrink from it. In the Reach, Mace Tyrell convened the banners in Highgarden's Great Hall. Lords Tarly, Redwyne, Rowan, Florent, and Hightower, along with many minor lords, assembled to hear the official word. Mace tried to keep the situation measured, but the fact was undeniable. The betrothal was broken, and House Tyrell now stood at odds with King's Landing. Many lords questioned whether this was wise. Some suggested that perhaps Margaery should reconsider. Others, hearing the rumors of Joffrey's cruelty, were less enthusiastic about tying the fortunes of the Reach to that boy's rule. They spoke of tradition, of how House Tyrell had pledged fealty to the Iron Throne for centuries. Olenna stood with Mace at the head of the hall, her voice cutting through the debate. "We will not sacrifice our blood to a monster. Should the Lannisters choose war, they will find the Reach ready. Let them come. In open battle, they cannot easily defeat us. Our fields feed the realm. We hold the advantage in supply. We hold the wealth of Highgarden. We are not sheep to be sheared." Her speech, peppered with her usual sharp wit, stirred a measure of pride among many of the Reach lords. They remembered the last war, how the Tyrells had marched to King's Landing's rescue against Stannis and saved the city at the Battle of the Blackwater. Was this the thanks they received? Garland Tyrell stepped forward, rallying the younger knights with impassioned words. "House Tyrell seeks peace, but not at the price of being ruled by fear and tyranny. We do not want another mad king or worse on the throne. We have a duty to the realm. We served loyally. Now we have been scorned. We cannot bow again." Those words found support among the knights who had witnessed Lannister arrogance in recent months. Even Randyll Tarly, who was known for strict discipline and realism, concluded that the Tyrell position might be morally and strategically justified. The Tyrells, if threatened, would have to answer with force. So the banners were called "Men Trained, Swords Sharpened, Ravens Sent." Highgarden prepared for the worst. Margaery Tyrell found herself an object of both admiration and worry among her people. Some said she was a heroine for refusing to marry a monster. Others lamented that her decision might plunge them into war. She felt that burden acutely. Every day she would walk in Highgarden's gardens, the sweet smell of roses teasing her senses, reminding her of a time when her future seemed bright and full of promise. Now the roses felt tinged with blood. She tried to push aside her guilt, telling herself that her choice was right, that she had saved herself from a wretched life and perhaps saved others from Joffrey's cruelty. But nights brought dark dreams. She saw King's Landing in flames, the streets filled with corpses. She saw Joffrey's sneer. She woke shaking, yet she persevered, leaning on Olenna for counsel and taking solace in the fact that her family still rallied around her. War did not erupt overnight. Tywin Lannister was no fool, and neither was Mace Tyrell. Messages passed back and forth, with both sides accusing the other of unreasonableness. The Lannisters demanded some form of apology, reparation, or reconsideration. The Tyrells demanded that King Joffrey publicly assure the safety of Margaery and show contrition for the cruelties he had committed. That was a line that Joffrey would never cross. And so the dance of power persisted, with each side bracing for the moment that would tip the balance from an uneasy standoff to open warfare. Then came the rumor that Stannis Baratheon was once again on the move. Word spread that he was rallying forces in the Narrow Sea, planning some bold strike. Tywin recognized that a kingdom divided was ripe for Stannis to exploit. He pressed harder on the Tyrells, hoping to unify the throne's might. The Tyrells, however, saw the Lannister overtures as attempts to corner them into submission. Still, both sides recognized that if Stannis were to march on the capital while the Tyrells sat in open rebellion, the realm could be lost entirely. This precarious balance kept swords sheathed for a time, as negotiations floundered. During this period, Margaery was rarely alone. Knights guarded her, fearful that Lannister assassins might try to snatch her. She retreated often to the reading room in Highgarden's library, or strolled with Loras along the castle walls, discussing strategies, regrets, hopes for a better future. She wondered if she would ever know peace again. Inevitably, though, the tension reached its breaking point. An incident in the Stormlands lit the spark. The Tyrell allied Lord Meadows at Grassfield Keep refused entry to a group of Lannister soldiers traveling south on some rumored errand, perhaps collecting taxes or seeing to some suspicious piece of Lannister business. That refusal escalated into a skirmish, with men killed on both sides. King Joffrey, upon hearing that his men had been insulted and attacked, demanded that the Tyrell banners come forth and offer redress. The Tyrells, for their part, called it a Lannister provocation. Tempers flared, and both parties began to move their armies. Soon, the Crownlands bristled with Lannister troops and their loyal bannermen from the Westerlands. The Rose Road teemed with Tyrell outriders and the armies of the Reach. The War of the Five Kings had ended not long ago, yet now the realm was on the brink of another cataclysmic conflict. The War of the Roses and Lions, some called it in quiet jokes that carried a grim undertone. On a muggy summer morning, Lannister forces marched out of King's Landing toward Tumbleton, led by Jaime Lannister, newly returned after his captivity. With him were Gregor Clegane's men, a fearsome presence. Tywin remained in the city, orchestrating the broader campaign, while Joffrey stayed behind guarded by the Kingsguard. Word reached Highgarden that the Lannister host was on the move, and Mace Tyrell immediately commanded that the main Tyrell army march to meet them. Loras Tyrell led a vanguard of cavalry, so famed for their skill that many a foe had quailed at the sight of the Tyrell standard. Randall Tarley, famed for discipline and cunning, commanded the foot soldiers. Garland Tyrell oversaw the archers and crossbowmen. They converged on the region around Tumbleton, a strategic crossing of the Mander River. For a few days, both armies camped on opposite sides of the wide river, exchanging threats through messengers, each building fortifications, waiting to see if the other would attempt a crossing. Margaery Tyrell was not present in the war camp, at her grandmother's insistence, for her safety. Instead, she remained at Highgarden, surrounded by loyal knights. Yet her mind drifted incessantly to Loras, Garland, and all the men at risk. She worried that this war was partly her fault, no matter the justifications. She confided this to Olenna, who responded with uncharacteristic gentleness. "My sweet girl, this war was always going to happen the moment that boy was set on the throne and we refused him. Had you married him, perhaps war might have been delayed. But can you imagine the cost to your spirit and in time likely to the realm? Sometimes we must choose between two poisons. Take heart that what we do now, we do because we will not yield to cruelty." A messenger arrived at Highgarden near dusk on the 7th day of the standoff near Tumbleton. His horse, lathered in sweat, stumbled as it came into the courtyard. The rider tumbled off, demanded water, and then delivered the news. The Lannisters had tried a dawn assault, attempting to cross the Mander under cover of heavy fog. Lord Tarley's men had spotted them and sounded the alarm. A fierce skirmish erupted along the banks. Gregor Clegane's men forced a crossing at a shallow ford, but were met by Garland Tyrell and his knights. Blades clashed, men screamed, the water ran red with blood. Jaime Lannister, clad in bright armor, was seen rallying Lannister troops on the east side of the river, while Loras Tyrell led a cavalry charge that nearly broke the Lannister line. The short version of the story: the Tyrells drove back the Lannisters, capturing several valuable prisoners. But the fighting was bloody, with losses on both sides. The next stage would be a pitched battle if no side yielded. Margaery listened to the messenger's account with her face pale, her eyes haunted. She asked if Loras was safe. The man bowed and said that Ser Loras was unhurt but exhausted, and Garland had taken a wound to his arm but was still commanding. The relief washing over her was followed quickly by renewed dread. This was only the beginning. Word of the day's events would carry back to King's Landing, and Joffrey would be furious at the setback. She could hardly imagine that Tywin would simply accept a defeat at Tumbleton. More armies would march, more blood would be spilled. Olenna pressed the messenger for every detail, then for news about Stannis or other potential threats. The messenger reported that Stannis was rumored to have gone to Dragonstone or perhaps even to the north, chasing after some call for help from the Night's Watch. The realm was in chaos, with every region still reeling from the previous war. In the days that followed, the armies near Tumbleton clashed repeatedly. Sometimes it was small cavalry raids, sometimes brutal attempts at crossing the river. Jaime Lannister found his old battlefield prowess tested by Randyll Tarly's disciplined approach. The Tyrell archers rained arrows from the western bank, inflicting grievous casualties on the Lannister foot. Gregor Clegane's savage assaults strained the Tyrell lines, but Garland's stern leadership and Loras's fearless charges repeatedly drove them back. It became a grinding stalemate. Tywin Lannister, hearing of the costly battles, debated pulling the army back to better defensive positions near King's Landing. But withdrawing would be seen as weakness, and the Lannister hold on the throne was already tarnished by Margaery's refusal. Still, each day the siege of Tumbleton threatened. Winter was creeping closer, and no side wanted a long war. Yet no resolution was in sight. Within King's Landing, tensions soared. The small folk, who had come to rely on Tyrell grain shipments, found food growing scarce. House Tyrell, no longer an ally, would not send the same bounty to feed the city's masses. Prices soared, and hungry crowds muttered and glared at the Red Keep. Whispers spread that if Tywin had not alienated the Tyrells, there would be bread for every table. Goldcloaks struggled to keep order. Meanwhile, King Joffrey's cruelty grew more erratic. He executed a baker accused of skimping on flour in the royal kitchens. He threatened to burn the flea-bottom slums if the populace did not show him proper respect. Cersei fanned his rage, while Tywin tried to maintain a semblance of control. But the strain on the city was immense. Underneath the surface, more and more people began to think that perhaps the Tyrells were in the right to refuse Margaery's betrothal to a king so callous. One fateful night, a band of Tyrell scouts slipped behind the Lannister lines, approaching the Crownlands closer than they had before. Their mission: gather intelligence, possibly sabotage some supply routes. Instead, they stumbled upon a shocking piece of news. Some disaffected bannermen near Rosby had begun discussing the possibility of defecting, or at least staying neutral, unwilling to fight a war that seemed to only enrich Lannister power while impoverishing the countryside. Those lords feared Joffrey's wrath, but also disliked the idea of tangling with the Tyrell host. A Tyrell scout overheard them speaking of forging a secret arrangement, offering Rosby's gates to a Tyrell envoy if it meant sparing them from an occupation by Lannister forces. This intelligence was swiftly conveyed back to Mace Tyrell. Olenna, upon hearing it, recognized an opportunity. If House Tyrell could peel away some Crownlands lords from the Lannisters, it might collapse the Lannister war effort or at least weaken it sufficiently that Tywin would be forced to negotiate terms more favorable to the Tyrells. Thus began a clandestine effort to sow disunity among the Lannister loyalists. Tyrell envoys in plain garb traveled through the Crownlands, quietly reaching out to lesser lords, reminding them that their fields depended on the bounty from the Reach. They suggested that House Tyrell, if acknowledged as rightful protectors of the realm from Joffrey's brutality, would ensure that these lands did not suffer. In return, these Crownlands lords only had to remain neutral or quietly sabotage Lannister movements. It was a subtle game of subterfuge that Tywin recognized was happening. Yet he had limited capacity to stop it while Jaime was pinned at Tumbleton. King's Landing grew more volatile by the day. Racked with rumors of betrayal, Joffrey responded with more cruelty, hanging men suspected of Tyrell sympathies, punishing families of any who dared to speak well of the Reach. Fear choked the streets, but fear also bred hatred. The turning point came in late autumn, when a Tyrell army under Randyll Tarly moved north along the Rose Road, capturing small Lannister outposts with minimal opposition from local lords. The road to King's Landing began to open. Jaime Lannister, battered from repeated skirmishes, made a desperate push at Tumbleton to break the Tyrell lines and cut them off from behind. In a pitched battle by moonlight, he led a cavalry charge that shattered the Tyrell perimeter. For a heartbeat, it seemed the Lannisters might force a rout. But Garland Tyrell, though wounded, rallied the infantry in a tight shield wall, while Loras led the Tyrell Knights in a flanking maneuver. The fighting was brutal man-to-man, lit only by torchlight and the pale glow of the moon. Jaime himself engaged Randyll Tarly in single combat. Steel clashed, sparks lit the air, each a reflection of clashing wills. In the end, Tarly struck Jaime down from his horse. Jaime's golden hand was battered, his sword knocked loose. A Tyrell man-at-arms nearly caved in Jaime's skull, but was stopped by Tarly's barked order to take him captive. By dawn, Jaime Lannister was a prisoner in Tyrell custody. Gregor Clegane lay dead with an arrow through his throat, and the Lannister army was in disarray, retreating east to regroup. News of Jaime Lannister's capture caused an uproar in King's Landing. Cersei was inconsolable, shrieking at Tywin to do something, to call upon every last banner. King Joffrey ranted that he would have Margaery Tyrell's head, along with every flower in the Reach. Tywin, though outwardly composed, recognized the gravity of the defeat. Jaime was not only his son, but the best chance the Lannisters had of maintaining any battlefield advantage. Without Jaime, the Lannister cause was crippled. Tywin dispatched urgent pleas for assistance to the Freys in the Riverlands, to the Boltons in the north, to the Eyrie, though that was a faint hope. Meanwhile, Randyll Tarly pressed the advantage, capturing key positions along the Rose Road, fortifying them in preparation for a final march toward King's Landing. The once shining capital now seemed at risk of a siege. Tywin withdrew more forces into the city, letting other areas fall to Tyrell or neutral rule. The tension soared. Within the Tyrell War Council, there was debate over the next step. Some lords advocated marching straight to the walls of King's Landing and forcing a surrender, possibly installing a new king, or at least forcing a regency that stripped Joffrey of power. Others worried that such a move would be disastrous if the city resisted fiercely, or if the Lannisters managed some cunning stroke. Olenna Tyrell, cunning as ever, looked beyond the immediate conquest. Taking King's Landing does us little good if we lose half our men in the process, or if the city starves. Remember the small folk. They will hate us if we come with fire and sword. Perhaps it would be more prudent to let the city see that we are not the true villains. Wait for them to turn on Joffrey themselves. Mace nodded gravely. And if they do not? Olenna pursed her lips. Then we do what we must. But let us not rush. In a tent near Tumbleton, Jaime Lannister languished in chains. His captors gave him decent food, but he was guarded day and night. Garland Tyrell visited him once, trying to gauge the possibility of a ransom or exchange that might end the conflict. Jaime's pride flared. He spat that the Tyrells would regret the day they crossed the Lannisters. Yet it was also clear that Jaime's capture was a significant bargaining chip. If the Tyrells offered to release Jaime in exchange for the dissolution of the betrothal and certain protections, would Tywin relent? The negotiations would have been complex enough, but King Joffrey's personal vendetta made them nearly impossible. Joffrey wanted Margaery punished, not simply left alone. He wanted her humiliated or dead. It was a matter of vanity and pride now. Tywin, more pragmatic, might have accepted a truce had Joffrey's demands not been so vindictive. As winter's chill descended, the Tyrell armies drew closer to King's Landing, their outriders raiding the outskirts of the Crownlands, capturing watchtowers, burning small caches of Lannister supplies. The city itself became a tinderbox of fear and resentment. The Goldcloaks were overworked, morale plummeted, and many desertions occurred. The once luxurious capital became a place of hunger. Bread prices soared to heights even the wealthy found shocking. Tywin issued edicts trying to regulate the price of food, but with the Tyrell shipments cut off, there was only so much that could be done. Cersei fumed at the crowd's discontent, labeling them ingrates and traitors. Joffrey's angry outbursts became more frequent. He forced one suspected Tyrell sympathizer to eat his own fingers before executing him. Word of this atrocity spread through the streets. Hatred for the boy king boiled near the surface, though no one dared say so openly. But the people remembered that Margaery Tyrell had once walked among them, smiling, distributing bread. She had been popular, and so resentment churned. All it took was a spark. That spark came when Tywin Lannister attempted to conscript more men from the city's already starving populace, drafting them into the king's army to bolster the lines. A riot broke out in Flea Bottom, soon spiraling out of control. The Goldcloaks struggled to contain it. Mobs poured into the streets, chanting curses at the king. Windows were smashed, shops looted, the city watch overwhelmed. Joffrey, outraged, demanded that the rabble be slaughtered. Loyal knights tried to restore order, but the chaos only grew. Entire districts of King's Landing erupted in fury. Tywin mustered the remaining loyal forces to hold the Red Keep, but the city itself was awash in bloodshed and panic. Some of the rioters called for the Tyrells, or even for Stannis, to come and free them from Joffrey's tyranny. Others simply sought vengeance for their hunger and mistreatment. Outside the walls, Tyrell scouts saw the smoke rising from the city. They witnessed the chaos. Randall Tarly, camped near the Blackwater Rush, realized that the moment might be at hand. He signaled Mace Tyrell at the main host, sending swift riders. The Tyrell lords met and they decided to advance. With the city in turmoil, King's Landing's gates might be unguarded or easily breached. A direct assault could be costly, but perhaps they could find a part of the walls where the watch had fled. That very night, under cover of darkness, the Tyrell vanguard approached the city's western gate. To their surprise, it stood wide open, with no sign of resistance except a few scattered guards. Civilians, their faces gaunt from hunger, watched warily from alleyways as Tyrell knights entered the city. Some even cheered, hoping these newcomers would restore order. The Goldcloaks that remained loyal retreated in disorganized clusters toward the Red Keep. Margaery Tyrell was not there to see it, but the Tyrell roses now fluttered from makeshift banners carried by men who had marched all the way from Highgarden for this moment. The city was essentially falling from within. Word of the Tyrell approach reached Tywin in the Red Keep. He called his men to arms, barricading the keep's entrances, preparing for a siege within the city walls. Cersei shrieked in despair. Jaime was still captive, and Joffrey, in a fit of terror and fury, demanded they kill every traitor in the streets. Tywin gave no such order. He could see that the game was nearly up. The cost of holding the city against both an internal uprising and a Tyrell force was staggering. In a final attempt to stave off disaster, Tywin dispatched Grand Maester Pycelle under a flag of truce to speak with the Tyrell commanders. The old man, trembling, carried messages of potential negotiation. But it was too little, too late. At dawn, columns of Tyrell spearmen and archers advanced through the city, met with minimal resistance. Randall Tarly led them methodically, imposing order where possible, though scattered violence continued in some districts. The battered Goldcloaks either surrendered or threw down their arms. Within the Red Keep, the Lannisters prepared for a last stand. King Joffrey refused to flee, refusing to be seen as a coward. Cersei tried to persuade him to take the royal fleet and escape to Casterly Rock, but Joffrey insisted he would personally behead Margaery Tyrell when the Tyrells dared enter the keep. Tywin, with a heavy heart, knew this was madness. He suspected that they had lost, But fatherly pride and loyalty to House Lannister prevented him from simply opening the gates. He decided to hold the fortress, hoping for some miraculous relief or at least for negotiations that might spare them from total ruin. The Red Keep was formidable, with high walls and stores of supplies. But the mood within was grim, with each passing hour bringing more desertions as men realized the city had essentially fallen to the Tyrells. Outside the keep, Mace Tyrell, Randyll Tarly, Garland Tyrell, and the other lords conferred. Some called for an immediate assault on the keep to take Joffrey's head. Others worried about the cost in lives, the possibility of damaging the keep and harming valuable hostages. Olenna Tyrell, who had arrived with Margaery the day after the city fell into Tyrell hands, made a compelling argument. Better to starve them out. Let them come to us. Blood and steel in the keep's corridors will benefit no one, and many innocents in the household might perish. Wait, and Tywin Lannister will see reason. The Tyrell lords, especially Tarly, recognized the wisdom in preserving men and avoiding a costly assault. So they settled in for a siege of the Red Keep within King's Landing itself. Margaery Tyrell, strangely enough, found herself walking through the city she once intended to call home. She wore a plain cloak, hooded, accompanied by half a dozen guards. She saw the devastation. Burned shops, bodies in the streets from the riots, hungry children clinging to mothers who stared with hollow eyes. Some recognized the Tyrell sigil and approached fearfully. Margaery saw in their eyes the same question. Would the Tyrells be any better than the Lannisters? She instructed her guards to distribute bread from the captured granaries, a small gesture to calm the starving populace. Word spread quickly, and soon crowds gathered wherever the Tyrell supplies were shared. Slowly, order returned to the streets. Margaery's presence as the flower that refused the cruel king became a symbol in the eyes of many. The small folk whispered that perhaps this was the queen they needed, a queen of mercy rather than a tyrant's bride. Days wore on, and the siege of the Red Keep was tense but bloodless. Margaery's mind churned with apprehension. Would Joffrey and Tywin yield? Or would Joffrey unleash wildfire or some other horror to stave off surrender? Tales of the Mad King's final days haunted many who lived through Robert's rebellion. The memory of the city's near destruction weighed heavily on them. Olenna quietly arranged for thorough searches for caches of wildfire, ensuring that if the Lannisters tried to replicate the Mad King's last desperate plan, it would be discovered. Meanwhile, negotiations commenced in halting steps. Pycelle again attempted to mediate, but Tywin seemed reluctant to hand over the king. So the Tyrells increased pressure by cutting off the keep's wells, setting a tight perimeter. The men inside began to suffer from thirst and hunger. Morale crumbled. Treachery bubbled within. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks, a faction of Lannister guardsmen, along with some knights in the Red Keep, mutinied against Joffrey, forcibly opening the gates in the dead of night, letting Tyrell soldiers in. The final confrontation was short and brutal. Joffrey, awakened in his chambers, shrieked for his guards. Only a handful responded. He grabbed his crossbow, threatening to shoot any who dared approach. A scuffle ensued. In the chaos, Ser Balon Swan tried to shield Joffrey, but was overpowered. Joffrey was seized, dragged kicking and screaming to the throne room. Tywin Lannister, upon hearing the tumult, recognized that it was over. By dawn, the Red Keep was in Tyrell hands. Tywin stood, unarmed, in the throne room beside a caged, howling Joffrey. The Tyrell banners draped over the walls. Randyll Tarly, Garland Tyrell, and Loras Tyrell confronted Tywin. Olenna watched from behind, silent, her face unreadable. Mace Tyrell, in a moment of solemn pride, asked Tywin for his formal surrender. Tywin, with set jaw and eyes that gleamed with residual anger, nonetheless knelt. The Lannister cause was spent. Joffrey, still yelling curses, was forced onto his knees beside Tywin. The dais was overshadowed by the great iron throne, that monstrous seat of swords. Margaery Tyrell arrived, flanked by knights, her steps echoing in the silence. She gazed upon Joffrey, now a sniveling wretch, stripped of his regal finery, hair disheveled, face contorted with rage and fear. She thought of what might have been her life as his queen consort. The thought made her shudder. In a voice that carried through the hall, Randyll Tarly declared Joffrey Baratheon unfit to rule, citing his cruelty, his tyranny, and the broken alliance. He cited the many atrocities: Ned Stark's execution, the torment of Sansa, the abuses heaped upon the people. Tywin stood stoically, saying nothing in defense of his grandson. The hush in the chamber was suffocating. A question loomed in the air: who would rule now? Would the Tyrells proclaim a new king? Would they puppet a different Lannister? Or would Stannis appear and claim the throne? When the moment for a final decree came, Margaery Tyrell found herself stepping forward. She did not want to be queen by bloodshed, but she recognized an opportunity to bring peace. She spoke softly, her words carrying in the hush. "The realm has suffered too long under the shadows of war. I refused to marry a monster, but I do not refuse the call of duty. If the realm wills it, I shall stand as Queen Regent until a suitable heir is determined, one who is proven worthy of the Iron Throne, a ruler who will not betray the people or defile the name of king." Her voice trembled only slightly. She glanced at Olenna, who gave her a subtle nod. Some of the Tyrell lords murmured approval. Others looked uncertain, but the logic was there. The Tyrells had brought down the monstrous king, had captured the city, and the people welcomed them. They had the power. If Margaery was crowned, she would have the support of her house. Yet a wave of relief might sweep the realm if a peaceful settlement followed. Joffrey shrieked from his knees. "You whore! You can't take my throne! You traitor!" He never finished his rant, as one of Tarly's men struck him across the face. Tywin said nothing. He remained kneeling, perhaps hoping that some mercy would be shown to House Lannister, or that negotiations might yield better terms than outright execution. And so the final act of Margaery's refusal echoed through the cavernous throne room. In that moment, she felt a strange calm, as though all her nightmares had converged into a single pivot point. She had not wanted war, but war had come. She had not wanted to see King's Landing taken by force, but force had proven necessary to dethrone a tyrant. Now that it was done, she tasted bitterness and relief in equal measure. The Tyrell banners that draped the walls flickered in the torchlight. She stared at the Iron Throne, that monstrous seat of power, forged from 1,000 swords of Aegon's enemies. The realm would look to her now, to the Tyrells, to see if they could do better than the Lannisters. She resolved that she would try to heal the scars left by Joffrey's cruelty, try to feed the starving people, try to be the queen the realm deserved, though she had once desired only to be a beloved consort. It was a weighty calling. With the flick of Olenna's gaze, one of the Tyrell heralds stepped forward, proclaiming that Joffrey Baratheon was deposed, that he would stand trial for his crimes. A rumble of agreement echoed in the chamber. Margaery exhaled. Outside, she could hear the roar of the city. People chanting, tumultuous celebrations, or perhaps fears of more chaos. The war was not wholly over, but the central conflict that had sparked it, Margaery's refusal to wed a cruel boy king, had reached its inevitable conclusion. In the days that followed, swift raven messages traveled the realm. Some lords recognized the new power structure and declared for House Tyrell, or at least remained neutral. Others decried the Tyrell usurpation, but without a strong Lannister alliance, they found themselves alone. Tywin, ever practical, negotiated for leniency for his family, especially for his daughter Cersei. Randyll Tarly, in his position as effectively the new hand or something akin to it, agreed to let Tywin keep Casterly Rock and his dignity, provided he publicly endorsed the Tyrell-led regency. The more vindictive lords of the Reach wanted to humiliate Tywin further, but Olenna believed in forging a stable peace. She insisted that Tywin remain a powerful lord, albeit one who would think twice before challenging them again. Cersei's fate was trickier, for she was mother to the deposed king. Yet with Jaime still a prisoner, Tywin was anxious to keep the Lannister line intact. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. Jaime Lannister would be released, so long as Cersei and Joffrey remained under Tyrell custody until the trial. Once a verdict was reached, if Joffrey was found guilty, there would be sentencing. The realm, exhausted by bloodshed, was content with this half measure for the moment. Margaery Tyrell found herself in the Red Keep's royal apartments, ironically occupying the same chambers once prepared for her as Joffrey's queen. She could barely stand to see the gold decorations, the Baroque furniture, the lavish bed that Joffrey had no doubt lounged upon. But she was determined to repurpose it, to scrub out any lingering sense of that vile presence. She began meeting with the city's leaders, the tradesmen, the guild masters, distributing grain, lowering taxes as soon as possible. Each measure, each small mercy, gradually endeared her to the populace. The Rose Queen, they called her, though no official coronation had taken place. Olenna worked tirelessly by her side, drilling her with the realities of rule and the unscrupulous nature of power. The Tyrell men, meanwhile, kept a tight hold on the city. They disbanded the old Goldcloaks, forming a new city watch under Tyrell leadership. It wasn't perfect, and tensions remained high, but the daily threat of violence receded. Word eventually arrived that Stannis Baratheon had indeed moved north, seeking support against the wildling threat or some rumored evil beyond the wall. He did not march on King's Landing. The Iron Islands, seeing an opportunity, began raiding the western coasts, but Tywin Lannister, newly chastened, rallied his own bannermen to repel them. The Freys in the Riverlands, lacking direction, sat still. The realm was fractured, but it slowly stabilized under the Tyrell ascendancy. In time, a gathering of great lords was convened in King's Landing to determine the future of the Iron Throne. Many believed Margaery Tyrell should be queen in her own right, though some wise voices cautioned that a queen regent might be best until a suitable claimant could be found from the Targaryen line or another house with a legitimate claim. The debate was complex, but the overall sentiment was that Joffrey Baratheon's rule was officially ended. As winter deepened, Margaery walked in the castle gardens that she was determined to restore, even in the cold. She wore a heavy cloak, her breath steaming in the frosty air. When she saw Sansa Stark approach timidly, she felt a surge of empathy. Sansa had returned to King's Landing under Tyrell protection, having found no real safety in the Vale. Their meeting was quiet, almost tearful. Sansa thanked her for refusing Joffrey. She had known how evil he was, and she had feared what might happen to Margaery. Margaery thanked Sansa in return for being brave enough to speak the truth, to warn her. The two young women walked amid the dormant rose bushes, reflecting on the heavy cost that had been exacted. Margaery could not help but think that, had she not refused, the realm might have stayed nominally at peace for a time, but Joffrey's shadow would have grown. Perhaps, in some ways, they had cut out a cancer. The realm might heal slowly, painfully, but it would heal. That evening, seated at a small council meeting, Margaery Tyrell and Olenna listened to the lords debate the city's finances, the settlement of refugees, the distribution of supplies from the Reach. Every so often, Margaery found herself drifting, remembering the day she stood in the Great Hall and refused Joffrey in that one stark, ringing sentence. She recalled the gasps, the horror, the knowledge that she might have condemned her house to destruction. Now, here she was, in a position of unprecedented influence, having forced the downfall of a tyrant. The realm had not been spared from war, but perhaps it had been spared from something even darker: years of Joffrey's cruelty, a slow poisoning of the kingdom's soul. When the meeting concluded, she walked with Olenna to the corridor, where torchlight flickered against the walls. Olenna paused, examining her granddaughter with a critical yet fond gaze. "You look tired, child," she said softly. Margaery nodded. "I feel tired, grandmother. There is so much rebuilding to be done." Olenna's lips twitched. "And so it is. But remember, you carry the hopes of Highgarden with you. The crown has been wrested from a cruel boy. The Tyrell rose grows in the sun once more. Whether you wear that crown yourself or pass it to another, you have done what many could not. You refuse to yield to darkness. Take pride in that." Margaery managed to smile, though she felt tears prick her eyes. She thought of all the lives lost in the war, of Tumbleton's fields soaked in blood, of Jaime Lannister's captivity, of the city's hungry faces. There was no joy in war, But perhaps there was a glimmer of hope now. She and her family had defied the union that would have enslaved her to a monster. They had refused to lay down their morals for the sake of an alliance built on fear. As she retired to her chambers, she knew the story was far from over. The realm would continue to shift and struggle. Alliances would form, betrayals would happen, new threats might arise. But Margaery Tyrell was no longer the docile maiden she had been when she first arrived in King's Landing. She had chosen to act, to risk everything for the sake of her own freedom and the chance at a better rule. In the end, that act of defiance had toppled one of the most feared dynasties in Westeros. She pulled off her cloak, rested it on a chair, and gazed out the window. The city stretched before her, rooftops glimmering faintly in the moonlight, the Blackwater reflecting stars overhead. Somewhere in that sprawl of streets, children finally slept with less terror in their hearts, no longer living under the threat of Joffrey's unpredictable rage. Perhaps she could give them more than just freedom from a monster. Perhaps she could guide them toward a gentler future. She breathed in the night air. Despite the chill, she felt a warmth in her chest, a quiet resolve. She had refused to be that boy's bride. She had refused to let the realm bend to cruelty. Come what may, she would not regret her choice. And so the seeds of a new era were sown in Westeros, watered by the blood of battle and the tears of the suffering. House Tyrell emerged ascendant, with Margaery as its beacon. A rose determined to bloom even in the winter. And though the Game of Thrones would forever continue, shifting and turning with every breath of wind, one truth burned bright. Sometimes, a single act of defiance can remake kingdoms. Margaery had been that defiance, and in her steadfast refusal, she had reshaped the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Margaery Tyrell awakened on the first morning of her new reality with the weight of a kingdom pressing upon her. Though she had slept in the royal apartments, she did not feel she had truly rested. The Red Keep's walls seemed heavy with ghosts from the war, with the echoes of Joffrey's shrieks and the bitter memory of all that had happened since the day she refused his hand. Now, outside her window, the city's streets stirred with a fragile anticipation. There was no more King Joffrey in command, but his presence still lingered in the rumors people whispered, in the scorch marks left by riot fires, in the faint stench of death that clung to corners of the capital. She rose quietly, slipping from the grand bed that once might have been prepared for her wedding night. The linens felt oppressive. She wanted none of them near her. She crossed the chamber, let her hair tumble free, and gazed into a polished mirror. Her eyes looked different, older, sadder. Maybe the reflection was only in her head, but she felt it all the same. Cautiously, she opened the tall windows leading onto a small balcony. A breeze came in, stinging with the chill of approaching winter. She inhaled, breathing in the sense of salt and soot and the faint tang of fish from the Blackwater. The city had always seemed a grand tapestry when viewed from a comfortable distance, but now she saw it in sharper lines. Soot-stained rooftops, columns of rising smoke, patches where houses had burned during the riots, half-collapsed walls. It was as though King's Landing itself had grown gaunt, scarred by the cruelty it had endured. She turned away from the view, reminding herself that there was work to do. The city was in her care now, or at least temporarily, until the realm decided the fate of the Iron Throne. As she dressed, she let her mind rove over the countless concerns that had dogged her dreams. There was the problem of supplies. The Tyrell caravans from the Reach were bringing in food, but were they enough to feed an entire city at the onset of winter? Then there was the matter of keeping order. The Gold Cloaks had been thoroughly gutted, their loyalty shredded by Joffrey's tyranny and subsequent desertions. Tyrell knights patrolled, but the people needed a police force, not an occupying army. And looming above all else was the question of succession. Would Margaery herself become queen? Did the realm truly want that? Or was a regency the better path until some more legitimate claimant could be found? She sighed as she tied the sash of a soft green gown embroidered with roses. Before she left, a pair of maids helped arrange her hair. They were quiet and nervous, watching her face as though uncertain how to speak. Margaery could imagine the rumors swirling among the servants, that she was a sorceress who had bewitched the city, that she would punish them for serving Joffrey, or that she was the gracious lady some still remembered handing out loaves of bread. She tried to project calm reassurance, smiling gently whenever she caught their eye. They relaxed a fraction, finishing their work with trembling efficiency. Once she felt composed enough to face the day, she made her way through the castle corridors. These halls, once patrolled by hound-like figures and Kingsguard, now brimmed with Tyrell men. Where gold lions had hung, new tapestries were going up, though not necessarily bearing Tyrell sigils. Many corridors were stripped bare, leaving only the cold stone, as if the entire keep was in the midst of shedding its old skin. A few Lannister guards had been allowed to remain, provided they swore to keep the peace under the new administration, but their presence was minimal. She saw no trace of Cersei or Joffrey. Both remained under guard in separate suites, effectively prisoners of state awaiting a trial. Margaery arrived at what used to be the small council chamber. Randyll Tarly stood waiting, his posture as rigid as an iron gate. Garland Tyrell occupied a seat near the table, a bandage peeking out from his tunic, a remnant of his wound from Tumbleton. Mace Tyrell, resplendent in Tyrell green and gold, was in the midst of conversation with a half-dozen lesser lords who had flocked to the city in the aftermath of the capture. Olenna Tyrell sat off to one side, receiving them with her usual cutting remarks. Sansa Stark was there as well, seated discreetly in a corner, under the watchful eye of Brienne of Tarth. An unlikely arrangement, but with the city's chaos, Sansa had found more comfort near the Tyrells than anywhere else. As Margaery entered, the low murmur of conversation paused. She inclined her head to the assembled lords. A hush stretched. For a moment, she felt their eyes on her, analyzing, awaiting the shape of her authority. Then Mace Tyrell's voice boomed. "My daughter has arrived. Let us set aside trifles and address the day's urgent matters." He waved the lesser lords to arrange themselves. Olenna made a small snort, presumably at Mace's pompous tone. Randyll Tarly stepped forward, a parchment in hand. "Your Grace," he said almost formally. Then he corrected himself with a terse cough. "My lady." They had not yet decided on what precisely to call her, though many men had begun calling her Your Grace out of habit, seeing her in the role of a queen. Margaery dipped her head in acknowledgement. She did not insist on any title. She only said, "What is the report, Lord Tarly?" He unrolled the parchment, scanning it with his keen eyes. "The bread distribution continues, but the stores within the city are sorely depleted. Our supply lines back to the Reach can handle the flow for now, but I must remind you that even the Reach will begin feeling the pinch with winter's approach. We can manage enough shipments to keep the city from starvation, but if the population swells with refugees or if the roads become blocked, matters grow dire." Margaery nodded. "I understand. We should prioritize rebuilding the roads and ensuring safe passage along the Rose Road. Are there any lords who have not submitted to the new order? Any bandits or brigands taking advantage of the chaos?" Randyll Tarly's lips compressed. "Some scattered resistance remains in the Crownlands, pockets loyal to Joffrey or Tywin, though Tywin himself has surrendered, as you know. In the Stormlands, the remnants of King Stannis's old supporters are present, but they're no threat to us at the moment. The main concern is that winter will bring out the worst in desperate men. Our outriders have already reported a few violent robberies on smaller roads. We're doing our best to patrol." Lord Rowan, a broad-shouldered man with streaks of gray at his temples, spoke up. "And the people in the streets? They are uncertain. Some say the Tyrell hold on the city is only temporary, that a new war will break out. We have their favor for the moment, given the bread distribution and the end of Joffrey's cruelty. But we must make sure to maintain order, or risk further riots." He shot a glance at Margaery. "If I may speak freely, many see you as a symbol of hope, my lady. Your presence might calm them more than any knight with a spear." Margaery tried not to let the words tighten her chest. She was keenly aware that all eyes in the room were upon her, weighing how she would respond. "I will do whatever is needed," she said quietly. "It may be wise for me to appear in the streets again, to show that the city's new regime is not a distant threat but a genuine caretaker. However, I'll need proper escort. I don't want to be the cause of a stampede if the crowds become too eager. Olenna cut in. Nonsense, child. You'll do fine. Give out your bread, your gentle smiles, and they'll love you. Besides, no one wants another bloodbath. Margaery heard the blunt note of cynicism in her grandmother's tone and took a breath. Yes, she agreed. I will prepare to walk among them again. That might alleviate some of their fears. Mace Tyrell cleared his throat, obviously preferring to talk about more grandiose matters. We have the question of the throne to settle as well. The city cannot remain leaderless. The realm indeed has been battered. We must present a united front. Slight tension rippled across the table. Some lords seemed eager to proclaim Margaery queen outright. Others seemed reluctant, wary that the North, the Vale, and other regions might challenge her authority. Since Robert's rebellion, the realm had never been so fractured, and a hasty coronation might stoke more conflict. Margaery knew these lords were waiting for her to speak, to show if she had the nerve to claim the Iron Throne or if she would choose a more cautious approach. She felt her pulse fluttering in her throat. "Let us not jump headlong into crowning me," she said softly. "We need a stable solution that all the great houses will accept, or at least respect. We have enough enemies. I've no desire to play the tyrant and risk plunging the realm into further war. A regency council, perhaps? We could invite the other major houses to send representatives, so that no one feels excluded. House Martell, House Arryn, House Stark, though the Starks are scattered. Even House Greyjoy, though they are complicated." Several men exchanged glances, uncertain. Olenna folded her hands, regarding Margaery with that shrewd, measured expression. Inviting your enemies to share power can be a dangerous thing, especially if you've only just seized the city, my dear. But it might indeed be better than sitting alone with a crown on your head, only to see armies gather on all sides. Lord Rowan ventured. "And what of House Lannister? Tywin has bent the knee, but do we trust him at a council table? He may try to sabotage any settlement or steer decisions to the advantage of Casterly Rock." Randyll Tarly frowned. "Let him come so we can keep an eye on him. If we drive him into a corner, we risk him plotting in secret or forging new alliances behind our backs. Best to keep him close and bound by the same rules as the rest." In the hush that followed, Margaery wondered what Tywin himself must be feeling. He was a proud man used to controlling kings. Now he had lost nearly everything. His grandson captive and dethroned, his family's name tarnished by cruelty. Yet men like him were never truly defeated while they drew breath. She suspected that Tywin would be scheming every possible angle, every alliance, every compromise. Even so, she did not yearn for revenge. Vengeance was a bottomless well. The realm needed peace, or as close as they could manage. "Very well," she said. "Let us move forward with the idea of a great council, to be convened once the city is secure. We will invite every major house. In the meantime, we govern under the authority of House Tyrell as regents. That means ensuring the people are fed, the laws are enforced, and no further riots break out. We will also need to handle the matter of Joffrey's trial." She paused, and the mention of Joffrey changed the mood in the room. Everyone remembered the boy's mania, the outrages he committed. Some, no doubt, wanted his head on a spike. "We do not stoop to the methods he used," Margaery said firmly. "He must face justice, not vengeance. I will not have him tortured. He will be tried fairly with evidence, with testimony. If he is found guilty, his sentence will be set by the council. Let that be a sign that we are not like the monster we've deposed." Randyll Tarly bowed his head in acceptance. "As you command, my lady. The people will see we are not a reign of terror. But many have called for blood. He was widely hated." "I know," Margaery replied softly. "I heard them chanting in the streets. Still, we must be the example, not the travesty." One by one, the lords nodded. Olenna's gaze lingered on her granddaughter's face, and in her grandmother's eyes, Margaery thought she saw a flicker of admiration. Perhaps also a faint concern that Margaery's gentleness could be exploited. But Olenna said nothing to contradict her. The meeting continued in a flurry of logistical details. How many guards would patrol which district? How quickly the Tyrell armies could return to the Reach to tend winter preparations? How to handle the smaller lords in the Crownlands who were still uncertain about swearing fealty to the new regime. Eventually, the meeting broke up and people drifted away. Mace and Randall Tarly left to inspect the city's defenses. Sansa rose, offering Margaery a faint smile before departing with Brienne to see about some arrangement for the refugees. Olenna remained, as did Garland. The three of them were left in the chamber, the glow of lamplight falling on the polished tabletop. Garland shifted, wincing at his bandaged arm. "Sister," he said, "I'm proud of you. This is all so new, but you handle it gracefully." Margaery gave him a weary smile. "I'm just trying not to let fear consume me. I don't want to repeat the chaos that's already befallen the realm." He nodded and gingerly rose from his seat, excusing himself to check on the city's new watch. After he left, Olenna beckoned Margaery closer. "Sit with me," the old woman said. Margaery complied. Olenna's voice took on that familiar purr of wisdom laced with a hint of reproach. "You're correct, of course, that vengeance solves nothing. A fair trial is the wise course. But these times will test your resolve. What if Joffrey's supporters plot to free him? What if his mother unleashes some cunning scheme?" Margaery tilted her head. "That's why we keep them under watch. Though I wonder about Cersei. She's not known for her rational thinking when it comes to her children. Are we certain she's safely contained?" Olenna gave a thin smile. "She's locked in a suite, guarded by our men. She can rant and rave all she likes. I doubt even Tywin would risk his fortunes to set her free if it meant open defiance of our terms. But watch her nonetheless. She has a cunning that's fueled by desperation." Margaery nodded. She felt a spike of unease, remembering how Cersei's eyes used to flick with hostility whenever she'd caught Margaery near Joffrey. Now that the roles were reversed, Cersei might be dangerously unpredictable. She forced the thought aside. "And Joffrey? He's well guarded, I trust." A small shrug. "Safely contained, though I hear it takes 2 guards just to keep him from throwing himself at the bars. He rails, curses, threatens. He's as unpleasant a prisoner as he was a king. I have no sympathy for the boy, but I do pity the poor wretches assigned to watch him day and night." Margaery felt no pity for Joffrey in her heart, but she took no pleasure in his suffering either. He had done monstrous things, but she saw no point in cruelty for its own sake. "Let him stand trial," she murmured, "and the realm will see us set a better example." Olenna nodded, then rose, leaning on her walking stick. "Come, child, we have other matters. Let us see how this city looks with its new mistress walking the streets." Her lips curved in a mild smirk. "Perhaps you can remind them we're not devils after all." They left the chamber together, stepping into the corridors lit by torches. The keep's hush was broken now by the occasional bark of a Tyrell sergeant or the rustle of servants trying to put the castle back in some semblance of order. Margaery felt the enormity of the transition. She was no longer a would-be bride scuttling through these halls in fear of Joffrey's wrath. She walked with her head high, guards following at a polite distance. Every so often, a servant or a guard would bow or curtsy, calling her Your Grace, though she had not been formally crowned. The weight of that made her stomach tighten. When they reached the courtyard, Olenna parted ways to speak with Mace Tyrell about the day's next tasks. Margaery, for her part, climbed into a carriage with a handful of guards, intending to ride out into the city. She had done something similar once before, when she had tried to win the small folks' affection as Joffrey's future bride, bringing bread and good cheer. Now, the dynamic was far different. She had effectively deposed the Boy King, but perhaps her goal was the same: show the small folk that she cared about them. Prove that House Tyrell did not intend to be just another tyrant. If she could succeed, maybe peace might hold. The carriage emerged from the Red Keep's gatehouse. A short row of Tyrell knights in shining armor accompanied them on horseback, banners fluttering from lances. The city had taken on a hushed, expectant mood. Where once the crowds had parted in fear of Joffrey's retinue, now people gathered tentatively at the edges of the street, gawking at the sight of Margaery Tyrell and her guard. She peered through the carriage window, seeing hungry faces, soot-stained clothes, eyes that carried 1,000 doubts. She could smell the tang of uncollected garbage, the stale sweat of too many people crowded together. Had the city always reeked so? After they progressed a short distance, she signaled for the carriage to halt. A hush fell over the onlookers. Margaery stepped out, flanked by 2 knights. People stared, startled to see her in the open. She lifted her voice, trying to project calm and warmth. "Good people of King's Landing, I know you have suffered. There is bread and fresh produce being delivered to the markets. We will ensure fair prices. If anyone troubles you, if any soldier or official demands coin unjustly, speak to the New City Watch or come to the Red Keep. We do not stand for the abuses you have suffered." A murmuring spread through the crowd. Some were still too shocked or wary to speak, but a few bolder ones called out, "My lady, is it true that King Joffrey is gone?" Another cried, "Bless you for bringing food. We starve." And a third voice, more bitter, asked, "How do we know you won't turn just as cruel?" Margaery's heart clenched at that last question, but she stood firm. "I cannot ask for your trust blindly," she said gently. "Give us time to show with deeds that we mean to care for the city, not torment it." The man who had asked the question stared back at her. She could see lines of anger in his weathered face, the hollow cheeks of a man who had known too many hungry days. At last, he nodded slowly, not quite convinced, but not outright hostile. She realized it would take more than words to mend these wounds. Action would be her test. She turned to one of her knights and motioned for him to distribute a bundle of bread that had been stowed in the carriage. As the loaves were handed out to the needy, a faint swirl of hope flickered in the crowd. It was a small gesture, but after so much cruelty, even the smallest kindness felt like sun breaking through storm clouds. Margaery mounted back into the carriage. As it rolled on through the winding streets, they repeated the process in 6 squares and alleyways, sharing bread and letting Margaery deliver her message. No grand speeches, nothing that sounded like empty promises, just a simple vow to try to make things better. She recognized many might not believe her, but it was a start. By midday, the crowd following her route had grown thicker, though still more cautious than celebratory. People had been whipped and terrorized for too long to break out in easy cheers. Yet there were faint smiles, a flicker of gratitude. Children stared wide-eyed as Margaery passed, nibbling on bits of bread they had just received. At last, the carriage returned to the Red Keep in the early afternoon. Margaery felt drained, not from the physical journey, but from the emotional weight of seeing the city's suffering. She stepped out onto the courtyard, where a flurry of activity greeted her. Olenna's voice snapped out orders to a steward. Several Tyrell bannermen were arriving from the western gates. Garland Tyrell stood with them, conferring about troop placements. At the far side, Sansa Stark stood with Brienne, trying to gather a group of small orphans that had lost their parents during the riots. The gloom in the courtyard lightened a bit when Sansa saw Margaery and came forward, curtsying. Margaery gently took her hand. "How was it out there?" Sansa asked in a hushed tone. "They're anxious, hungry, suspicious, but not beyond hope. We gave out as much as we could. It's never enough." Margaery looked past Sansa at the ragged children, 3 wide-eyed little ones with sunken faces. "Are you helping them?" Sansa nodded, a tremor in her voice. "They lost their mothers in the riots. They have no father to speak of. I thought, perhaps a place could be found for them. A stable job for the older boy, the younger two might be fostered somewhere. They remind me of," she swallowed, "of what I was when I arrived here, alone and afraid." Margaery squeezed her hand. "We'll find them shelter. Thank you for your kindness. Perhaps we could use a portion of the keep's kitchens to feed children like them. We can't solve every sorrow, but we must try." She summoned a steward and instructed him to take the orphans to a safe wing of the keep, set aside an area with cots, and provide regular meals until they could find a more permanent arrangement. The steward, a newly appointed Tyrell man, bowed and hurried to carry out her orders. Sansa watched him depart with the orphans, a look of relief and sorrow intermingling on her face. "Thank you, my lady," she said softly. Margaery nodded. "We have to do better than the ones who came before us. Otherwise, what was the point?" A flurry of horns at the main gates startled them both. Margaery turned to see the portcullis lifting as a large retinue arrived, flags fluttering. The banners were a combination of gold, red, and green, though not the usual Lannister ones. Randyll Tarly strode forward, flanked by knights, to meet the newcomers. Margaery recognized the red wine sigil on a few banners, as well as House Hightowers. These were Lords of the Reach, come at last to see the new seat of power. She whispered to Sansa, "Our family's arrival. More lords from the south, I suspect. Come, let us greet them." Together they crossed the courtyard as the retinue dismounted. Lord Paxter Redwine was there, with an entourage of his knights and some of his family. Leighton Hightower had sent a son to represent him, since the Lord of the Hightower himself rarely traveled far from Old Town. There were a few lesser lords too, all from the southern regions. Margaery greeted them warmly, but she noted their complicated expressions. They had arrived in a city that had just undergone violent upheaval to find a Tyrell near queen, a dethroned boy king locked in a cell, and no certain plan for the future. Polite courtesies were exchanged, but she sensed their unspoken questions. Are we going to war again? Will the other kingdoms accept this new arrangement? She gave them her practiced smile, ushering them into the Red Keep to refresh themselves from the long journey. While they settled in, she took a moment to speak quietly with Paxter Redwine, a stout man of middle years with a trim beard. He was loyal to House Tyrell but also cautious. "My lady," he said, "congratulations on your success. Many in the Reach admire your boldness, but there is concern as well. Some worry that by deposing a king of Westeros, we might have made ourselves kingslayers in the eyes of other houses. Even if he was a wretch, the stigma of treason is not so easily shed." Margaery tried to respond calmly. "We did not slay him. We removed a tyrant from power. The realm was crying out for relief. The city itself turned on him before we arrived." Redwine considered, nodding. "Indeed, let us hope the rest of Westeros sees it that way. My ships have been patrolling the seas around the Arbor. We have heard rumors that the Lords of the Vale remain neutral, the North is still in disarray, and as for Dorne, well, you know how they hold their grudges. But perhaps in time we can coax them to see sense." Margaery sighed. "I hope so. We intend no oppression, only a stable realm. Let me know what resources you need to continue shipping grain. The city starves without our supply lines." He reassured her that the Redwines remained committed to feeding the capital, though they, like everyone else, had to watch their stores in winter. "We are behind you, my lady," he finished. "But it would be wise to show strong leadership. The realm hates a vacuum." She thanked him and let him go to rest. The same refrain echoed in her mind. Leadership. Everyone expected her to assume the throne or at least to shape the new government. But she recalled how precarious it was to claim kingship. Robert Baratheon had had the advantage of Targaryen unpopularity, plus the swords of the Vale, the Stormlands, and the North. Margaery had mainly the backing of the Reach, with the Westerlands uncertain, the Riverlands shattered by the war, and the North locked in its own chaos. Seizing the throne by force could lead to a new wave of conflict, but leaving it empty risked the realm splintering further. She needed a plan that satisfied the great houses. For that, she would need allies beyond the Reach. As she mulled this over, an attendant approached, bowing. "My lady, Lord Tywin requests a private audience with you." The request made her shoulders tense. She had not spoken with Tywin directly since that day in the throne room when he knelt before the Tyrell banners. A part of her hesitated. He was dangerous, cunning, a wounded lion that might lash out. But refusing to see him would only fuel suspicion. After a moment of silent deliberation, she nodded. "Very well. Show me to him." She took a handful of guards with her, traveling a winding route through the keep to the rooms where Tywin was under a form of house arrest. They found him in a large chamber near Maegor's Holdfast, once used by high-ranking guests. Guards stood at the door, letting Margaery and her retinue pass. Inside, Tywin waited by a table, dressed simply in a dark tunic with a lion's head clasp. His posture was as rigid as ever, his pale eyes steady. It was a strange tableau. The old lion and the young rose, meeting in a hush that reeked of tension. "My lord," Margaery said, inclining her head politely but not subserviently. Tywin returned the courtesy with a slight bow, or the closest approximation he would give. "My lady," he replied, his voice carefully even. She paused, waiting for him to speak first. He studied her face in silence, as though trying to gauge the measure of her. Then he said, "I see you are settling into your new role with competence. The city has not descended further into chaos. That is good." Margaery let out a quiet breath. "We are trying. There has been enough chaos." Tywin gestured to a chair, an invitation to sit, though it was also a subtle suggestion that she did not outrank him in his own mind. Margaery remained standing for a heartbeat longer than necessary, just to remind him that she could choose. Then she settled into the seat. "You wanted to speak with me?" she prompted. He lowered himself into a seat across from her. The table between them was empty, save for a small pitcher of watered wine. No one poured a cup. Felt too formal, too tense for that. Tywin folded his hands. "We both know the realm is in a fragile state. My family has lost control of the throne. Your family has it for the moment. But the question remains, how will you maintain it?" Margaery chose her words carefully. "I don't intend to maintain it as a personal trophy. My goal is to stabilize the realm and form a council representing its major houses. We will decide on a rightful monarch or a suitable arrangement for governance." A flicker of something, cynicism or perhaps respect, crossed Tywin's face. "That sounds lofty and prone to entanglements. The realm does not rule itself by committee. Sooner or later, one person must sit the throne. One name must be recognized. Otherwise, you only invite another war." She gave him a level stare. "Are you suggesting I simply put the crown on my head and declare myself queen?" Tywin's mouth quirked. "That is one possibility, but you must consider the reaction and the cost. Many might resist yet another new dynasty. Alternatively, you could place Tommen Baratheon on the throne, the younger brother to Joffrey, assuming you can confirm he is safe. He is still a child, untainted by Joffrey's misdeeds. That would preserve the fiction of Baratheon inheritance. You, as the regent or queen regent, would effectively guide the kingdom. It may appease some of the more traditional lords." Margaery blinked. She had nearly forgotten Tommen in the swirl of events. He was a boy of 8 or close to that. Gentle, kind-hearted, nothing like Joffrey. "But Tommen is a Lannister by blood," she said softly. "And the rumor that all Cersei's children were fathered by Jaime hasn't faded. Would the realm accept him as a true Baratheon? He is also your grandson." Tywin shrugged. "The realm accepted Joffrey, at least for a time. Most lords prefer stability to open truth. If they must swallow some genealogical half-truths, they will. But the question is not about paternity alone, is it? It's about power. Tommen would be an easier figure to rally behind than Stannis or an unknown Targaryen across the sea." Margaery's mind raced. Indeed, hidden in Tywin's suggestion was a desire to keep the throne in the Lannister line. But it also might be a pragmatic solution if she wanted a less bloody path to acceptance. "So you propose that I set Tommen on the throne, let him be crowned, with me as regent, and presumably you would expect a role in his guardianship." He allowed himself a thin smile. "I imagine your grandmother would tear out my eyes if I tried to claim too much. But yes, I would expect a place in the new order. House Lannister remains powerful, and we are not your enemies. Not if you handle this sensibly." Margaery thought of Joffrey rotting in a cell, awaiting trial. What of Joffrey, then? If Tommen is to be king, that disinherits the older brother. We cannot have 2 kings at once. Tywin's eyes were unreadable. Joffrey sealed his fate by his actions. He can hardly be king if the realm despises him. As for what is to become of him, you have mentioned a trial. Let him stand trial. If the verdict is guilty, perhaps the penalty is exile to the Night's Watch, or some suitably humiliating punishment. If it satisfies the realm, no one need raise arms on his behalf. She inhaled slowly. Tywin's practicality was as chilling as it was impressive. This was a man who could disown a grandson for the sake of the family's greater survival. You would be content to see your eldest grandson stripped of all titles and shipped off beyond the wall? She asked. Content is not the word, Tywin said, but it may be necessary to preserve the realm from further strife. Joffrey's own monstrous behavior brought us here. You think me heartless, I'm sure, but I do what must be done. Always have. Margaery was silent for a moment, absorbing the shock that Tywin would cast aside Joffrey so easily. But she reminded herself. Tywin Lannister was the man who orchestrated the Red Wedding, who had once shattered houses without remorse. He was not known for sentimentality. And what of Cersei? He hesitated. She is Tommen's mother. If Tommen becomes king, she will likely expect some role in his upbringing. But you would be the regent, at least in name. Two mothers, if you will, though I suspect you and she would not get on well. Still, it is a better arrangement than open war. Another possibility. She may prefer to return to Casterly Rock, leaving Tommen here. That might be best for everyone. Margaery's thoughts churned. Did she want to share power with Cersei Lannister? Could that possibly work without bloodshed? She could only imagine the resentful fury simmering beneath Cersei's skin at this very moment. The idea that they might co-regent Tommen was almost absurd. Yet the alternative was telling Cersei to be gone, or imprisoning her for life, which might only invite more enmity from the Westerlands. Or, indeed, from Tommen himself once he was old enough to understand. It's an option, Margaery said at last, guarded. I would have to discuss this with my family, and with the other lords. We want a broad consensus, if possible. Tywin inclined his head. Of course, I suggest you move quickly. The realm hates uncertainty. She wondered if he was offering the best path or if he was weaving a cunning trap. Is that all you wish to discuss? She asked quietly. His gaze flicked to the nearest guard, standing stoic by the door. That is enough for now, though I trust we will speak again soon, my lady. He rose to his feet, offering a stiff half-bow. She stood as well. In that moment, she recognized that in the Game of Thrones, alliances shift quickly, and your foe can become your reluctant partner if the circumstances demand it. She never would have imagined forging any arrangement with Tywin Lannister, but here he was, presenting a path to a stable realm. Whether or not it was a path covered in hidden snares, she had yet to determine. She departed, her mind swirling. Tommen Baratheon as king, would that truly restore peace? He was a sweet-natured boy, at least from the few times she had encountered him, docile in a way Joffrey never was. The realm might accept him more easily than a crowned Tyrell. It might calm the Stormlands, some of which still felt a vestigial loyalty to the Baratheon name. Yet it also meant allowing the Lannisters to remain near the seat of power, albeit with Tyrell might overshadowing them. It was not an ideal solution, but no solution was ideal after so much bloodshed. The Great Council notion was still on the table, but Tywin was likely right. Without a recognized figurehead, the council might degenerate into bickering, each region pushing its own candidate. Time was not on their side. She reported the conversation to Olenna, Mace, Randyll Tarly, and the other Tyrell leaders that evening. Reactions were mixed. Some bristled at the idea of placing a Lannister-blooded child on the throne. Others saw it as a shrewd compromise. Olenna's eyes narrowed as she listened. He suggests Tommen? Of course he does. He wants to keep Lannister blood on the throne. But it might well be the smoothest way forward, she conceded, fingers tapping on the table. Better a pliable child than a monstrous young man. And if it cements peace, well, we have endured enough war. Mace Tyrell was more openly conflicted. If we enthrone Tommen, then where does that leave House Tyrell? We did not come all this way just to remain second. But I suppose if Margaery is regent, that is not truly second. Randyll Tarly gave a brusque nod. I've fought enough battles to know the cost. If enthroning Tommen prevents another spate of bloodshed, I'll support it. But I advise caution. Tywin might attempt to manipulate the regency. Olenna scoffed. Let him try. We have the city, we have the largest army, we have the grain. The moment he steps out of line, we can muzzle him. But we need to keep him mollified enough not to conspire with outside forces. The discussion was lengthy, with some lords still holding out for the notion of Margaery simply being declared queen. Yet the pragmatic minds in the room recognized that might provoke immediate challenges from other houses, not to mention the lingering supporters of Stannis. In the end, it was agreed they would at least entertain Tywin's suggestion. The trial of Joffrey would still proceed, giving everyone a sense that justice was being served. Then, if the Great Council gave its nod, the city would accept Tommen as king, with Margaery named as queen regent until he came of age. In the following days, as the city stirred with rumors, Margaery worked tirelessly to maintain order. More lords arrived from the Crownlands, from the Reach, even from a few pockets in the Stormlands. They found the capital calmer than expected, albeit tense. The Tyrell knights kept the peace, ensuring the markets were well stocked, punishing any who sought to loot or cheat the populace. Slowly, the people began to accept the new regime. They saw Margaery continuing her daily forays into the city, checking on the distribution of supplies, visiting makeshift orphanages, even stepping into sick houses to speak with the ill. These gestures did not solve the city's deep problems, but they offered a sliver of solace. Whispers of our Rose Queen spread, though she was not yet queen in name. At last, the day came when Joffrey's trial was announced, to be held in the throne room. The throne room itself had been meticulously cleaned since the day of his downfall. New rushes on the floor, the broken windows replaced, the dais shining under fresh torchlight. Soldiers from the Reach lined the perimeter. Lords and ladies were invited, though not required to attend, and many did, eager for a glimpse of the spectacle. On the dais, a raised wooden platform had been set, with a table for the presiding judges. Margaery, Olenna, Randyll Tarly, and a handful of other High Lords would act as the tribunal. Tywin Lannister was also permitted a seat among them, though carefully placed, reminding everyone he was part of the settlement but not above suspicion himself. When the hall filled, a hush descended. Margaery, dressed in a rich green gown with gold thread, approached the dais. She felt her pulse drumming in her ears. She took a seat in the center, flanked by Randyll Tarly and Lord Rowan, with Olenna and Tywin to either side. The public benches held a mixture of courtiers, curious small folk, and guards. Sansa Stark sat near the front, her eyes large with apprehension. Margaery gave her a reassuring look. Then, at a signal from a herald, Joffrey was brought in. He was barely recognizable to those who had known him as a smirking boy king. His hair was unkempt, his face thinner, and he trembled with suppressed rage. Shackles clinked at his wrists. A half-dozen Tyrell guards marched him in. He scanned the throne room, face twisting in fury when he saw Margaery on the dais. He tried to lunge forward, but the guards yanked him back, forcing him to his knees at the foot of the dais. The herald announced the purpose of the trial, to determine if Joffrey Baratheon, formerly styled King Joffrey of the houses Baratheon and Lannister, was guilty of crimes against the realm, including murder, tyranny, and abuses of his power. Joffrey's shrill voice rang out, "I am your rightful king. This is treason. I will have your heads, all of you." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Randyll Tarly slammed a staff against the floor, silencing Joffrey. Margaery sat very still, refusing to show fear. When the hush returned, she spoke in a clear voice. "Joffrey Baratheon, you stand accused of executing Eddard Stark without just cause, of torturing and tormenting subjects, of ordering abuses against the people of King's Landing, among other charges. You will be given the chance to speak and to hear witnesses. This is not a kangaroo court. Do you understand?" She forced herself to look directly into his eyes. They were full of hate. "Shut your mouth, you whore," Joffrey spat, earning him a swift blow across the back from a guard. The crowd made a collective hiss of disapproval. Margaery's cheeks flushed. If she responded in anger, it would only degrade the proceedings. She steadied herself, ignoring the insult. "We will proceed," she said calmly. The evidence was methodically presented by a handful of witnesses. Sansa Stark testified that Joffrey had forced her to look at her father's head, that he had tormented her with threats and physical abuse. A trembling baker recounted how Joffrey had ordered him flogged for not baking enough bread. Gold-cloaked deserters came forward, telling how they'd carried out orders under fear of death. Orders that entailed beating small folk who dared complain about hunger. It was a grim catalogue of cruelty, and each testimony chipped away any lingering notion of Joffrey's innocence. Joffrey snarled, spat, cursed each witness. He denied everything, calling them traitors, liars, fools. But his denials rang hollow in a room full of those who had suffered or knew someone who had. Tywin Lannister maintained a stony silence, his gaze fixed on the far wall. Margaery sensed that he was distancing himself from this downfall. Olenna watched with a kind of icy satisfaction. Finally, the last witness spoke, a merchant's widow whose husband had been killed in a riot, after Joffrey's men fired crossbow bolts into the crowd for sport. She wept as she described finding her husband's body. The hush in the throne room grew leaden with sorrow. Even the hardest knights seemed ill at ease. When the testimony ended, Joffrey was given the chance to offer his own defense. He had none. All he did was scream that he was the rightful king, that the entire city was guilty of treason. He bellowed insults at the Tyrells, spat in Tywin's direction, and finally had to be gagged at Randyll Tarly's order. There was no real doubt as to the verdict. The tribunal retired briefly to a private antechamber to confirm it. Even if some might have felt pity for the boy, the evidence was overwhelming. He was guilty 100 times over. Margaery, Olenna, Randyll Tarly, Tywin, and Lord Rowan stood in a tight circle. The tension was thick. A guard removed Joffrey's gag so he could at Leah. St. hear the decision. Margaery stepped forward. Her voice trembled slightly, but she projected it so all could hear. Joffrey Baratheon, you are found guilty of murder, cruelty, and tyranny. By the laws of the realm, the punishment for these crimes is death. A ripple of mixed relief and shock went through the crowd. Joffrey froze in his shackles, no longer screaming, as if the reality of a death sentence had momentarily stunned him. Margaery continued, however, the council acknowledges that you are still a child, however monstrous your actions. We also recognize the realm has had enough bloodshed. We will consider an alternative sentence if there is a means to separate you from power and ensure you can do no further harm. At that, Randyll Tarly spoke, his voice firm. The Night's Watch is one such option, but it is customarily for criminals seeking a chance to atone. It would mean a life of service on the wall, never to return. Or we carry out the sentence of death. Those are the choices, if the tribunal so decides. Joffrey's eyes darted, wild. He sucked in a breath, trying to lunge forward, but the guards clamped him in place. Margaery offered him one last chance at dignity. Will you take the black, Joffrey Baratheon? He spat in her direction, though the gag was partially reapplied so it came out as a muffled, furious noise. His entire face twisted. He did not yield. He refused to show any sign of repentance. The silence that followed was more damning than any words. Tywin Lannister, for the first time, spoke aloud. Your Grace, he said, addressing Margaery. Since he refuses to bend, I see no choice. The law is clear. Margaery swallowed. She remembered how she had dreaded wedding Joffrey, how she had fled the prospect of being bound to him forever, and how that refusal had set in motion everything else. She thought of Sansa's tears, the city's starving crowds, Ned Stark's severed head. Perhaps the best mercy she could give the realm was to bring closure to this horror. She let her gaze travel the crowd. Many faces were cold with hatred for Joffrey. Some looked grim but resigned. She recognized that no one there wanted him free. With a final breath, she pronounced the sentence, her voice carrying. Then it is death. No outcry erupted. No wave of protest. Instead, a somber acceptance. Some in the crowd even exhaled in relief. Joffrey howled behind his gag, thrashing, until the guards seized him. The hall parted, letting the guards drag him off to the yard where the sentence would be carried out. Margaery felt her stomach twist. A part of her wanted to walk away, to not see the final moment of violence. But she also felt a responsibility to witness the consequences of her rightful verdict. So she rose and led the tribunal outside, to a corner of the Red Keep's courtyard, where a newly set block stood. The hush that descended was eerie as more and more people gathered, forming a wide ring. Overhead, the sky was gray with low clouds, as if the heavens themselves prepared to weep. The guard forced Joffrey's head onto the block. He writhed and cursed. Randyll Tarly took a heavy executioner's sword. Margaery kept her face composed, though her heart pounded. She did not want to let her personal hatred decide this, but it was not about hatred now. It was about justice, about ensuring the city saw that tyranny carried a price. Olenna stood near, her lips pressed into a thin line. Tywin stood further back, arms folded, face carved from stone. Margaery could not read his emotions in that moment. Perhaps even he felt some pang of sorrow for the grandson he had lost to cruelty and arrogance. Joffrey's eyes darted wildly, searching the crowd for someone to save him. Then, with a single stroke, Tarly's sword ended the boy king's life. Blood splattered across the courtyard stones. Many in the crowd flinched, some gasped, but no one cheered. It was a heavy moment. Joffrey's body twitched, then lay still. Margaery's breath left her in a long, trembling exhalation. She could not deny a swirl of feelings. Revulsion at the violence, relief that the terror was finally over, and a haunting sadness that a boy's life had gone so hideously awry. Had he been older? Had he been shaped by different hands? Might he have been saved from this fate? Sansa Stark stood near the back, tears shining in her eyes, though Margaery sensed they were not tears of grief for Joffrey but rather for the entire tragedy. Margaery stepped away from the block, her knees feeling unsteady. Olenna's hand clasped her elbow, guiding her toward the keep. The crowd parted for them. This was the end of one chapter, a dreadful chapter that had begun the day Robert Baratheon had died and placed Joffrey on the throne. Now that throne stood empty, waiting for the next occupant. Margaery tasted a mingling of relief and dread. That evening, the city was oddly quiet. Joffrey's head was displayed briefly on the walls, a stark warning to any who would replicate his cruelty. Then it was taken down, for no one wished to dwell on the visage of that twisted boy. Rumors spread quickly, from Flea Bottom to the nobles' manors. Some small folk whispered that the city was cleansed of a great evil, others that they had seen the demon that possessed Joffrey's soul rising into the sky. Nonsense, all of it, but it revealed how deeply he had terrified them. The day after the execution, an unusual calm settled over King's Landing. Even criminals seemed reluctant to stir. The Tyrell watch found fewer disturbances than on any day since the takeover. Perhaps the city was simply exhausted. In the Red Keep, Margaery was not allowed much time to reflect before the next matter pressed. Tommen Baratheon. A group of Tyrell knights, accompanied by Tywin's men, traveled beyond the city to fetch Tommen from Rosby, where Cersei had sent him earlier in the war. The boy arrived, frightened and pale under heavy guard. Margaery greeted him in the courtyard. He was only 8, with round cheeks and wide eyes. He looked up at Margaery with something akin to awe, as though uncertain whether she was friend or foe. She knelt to meet him at eye level, trying to smile reassuringly. "Hello, Tommen. I am Margaery. Do you remember me?" He nodded shyly. You were going to marry my brother," he murmured. She swallowed, not wanting to remind him that his brother was just executed. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Let's get you inside. We'll make sure you're warm and well-fed." He nodded again, casting a glance at the walls, as if half expecting Joffrey to appear. Then he followed her inside. Over the next few days, Margaery and Olenna carefully eased Tommen into the reality of what had happened. They did not dwell on the grisly details of Joffrey's crimes, only telling him that Joffrey was gone, that Tommen was now the rightful heir to the throne. Tommen seemed overwhelmed. He was a sweet-natured boy who liked kittens, candies, and playing knights. He did not comprehend the intricacies of politics or war. Seeing his quiet, unassuming manner, Margaery's heart ached. Such a tender child might be torn apart by the savage Game of Thrones. But maybe, with the right guidance, he could grow into a better king than his brother. Almost any king would be better than Joffrey, she thought. Tywin pressed for a swift coronation. Olenna favored waiting for the Great Council. Mace Tyrell, always eager for pomp and ceremony, wanted to stage a grand crowning to legitimize the new monarchy in the eyes of the city. After a week of heated debate, they compromised. A formal coronation would be held soon, but the Great Council would also be convened. Leading lords from across Westeros would be invited to witness the crowning and confirm Tommen as king, provided they recognized the Tyrell-led regency. If any house refused to attend, they risked isolation or further conflict. It was a high-stakes gambit, but it might force the realm to unify behind a single throne at last. Invitations went out via Raven to the major houses. Martell in Dorne, Arryn in the Vale, Tully, though House Tully was in disarray, with Riverrun under siege from the Freys. The north was a patchwork of Bolton dominance and scattered loyalists to the Starks, but Ravens went there too. Even the Iron Islands received an invitation, though no one expected the Ironborn to bow so easily. Margaery prayed that at least a handful of these lords would attend. If enough recognized Tommen's claim, they could forge a peace. If not, another war might loom. And what role would she play? As Tommen's prospective regent, she was given a new set of apartments near his, so she could guide his daily lessons and watch over him. She sat with him during meals, gently teaching him courtly manners, explaining the concept of justice in ways an 8-year-old could grasp. Cersei, still a prisoner in comfortable quarters, demanded to see her son. With reluctance, Margaery allowed short, supervised visits, always making sure Tyrell guards were present. Cersei burned with resentment, but she seemed to realize that if she caused too much trouble, her privileges would be revoked entirely. She tried to poison Tommen against Margaery with subtle whispers, but the boy's innocent mind did not fully absorb the hate. Margaery found him asking shy questions. "Why does Mother say you're a wicked temptress? You don't seem wicked." Margaery had to mask her exasperation and simply say, "She's upset. Sometimes people say unkind things when they're angry or afraid. We must all try to forgive." News trickled in from across the realm as the weeks passed. The Vale responded that Lord Robert Arryn was ill, but perhaps a delegation might be sent by Peter Baelish, though none in King's Landing were certain if that was good or ill. Dorne was silent for a time. Then a raven arrived from Prince Doran, saying he would consider attending if his health permitted. House Martell had many reasons to hate the Lannisters for Elaya's murder, so bridging that gap might be challenging. The north was in chaos. Ramsay Bolton reportedly menaced the countryside, while some loyalists to the dead king in the north, Robb Stark, still held out hope for the Stark girls. Tyrion Lannister, who had vanished during the war, was rumored to be in Essos, or maybe the Free Cities. None knew for sure. Stannis Baratheon was rumored to be at the Wall, helping defend against wildling incursions. The realm was a jigsaw puzzle of alliances and rumors, but King's Landing itself was slowly stabilizing under Tyrell rule. At last, the day of Tommen's coronation dawned. It was a subdued affair by royal standards. No tournament, no extravagant feasts, but it was still more lavish than anything the city had seen in months. The Great September had been scrubbed clean of the lingering smoke from the riots, fresh flowers arranged along the aisles. Tommen arrived in a modest procession, escorted by Tyrell knights. Tywin walked near him, as did Margaery. The boy wore a simple but regal outfit of Baratheon black and gold, trying valiantly not to show how nervous he was. The silent crowds watched from the Sept's pews. Dozens of lords were present, though not all major houses had come. A handful of envoys from the Vale, a party from the Reach, the new lords of the Stormlands, and even a minor representative from Dorne stood by with carefully composed faces. None from the Iron Islands, none from the Bolton-dominated north, and the Riverlands only had a ragged band of lesser lords who had escaped the frays. As the High Septon placed a small golden crown upon Tommen's head, the watchers bowed. He was pronounced Tommen of the House Baratheon, the first of his name, King of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. Tommen's cheeks were flushed pink. Margaery saw the faintest tremor in his small hands. Then came the moment for the regency. The High Septon read a formal decree from the Great Council of Lords who had gathered in King's Landing, naming Margaery Tyrell as Queen Regent, to rule in Tommen's name until he came of age. Tywin Lannister, though present, did not contest it. Olenna and Mace Tyrell exchanged satisfied glances. So it was done. Margaery, wearing a circlet of gold roses around her brow, stepped forward and accepted the oath of loyalty from the council. She then turned to Tommen, knelt, and pledged to guide him faithfully and guard him from harm. The boy looked relieved, as if clinging to her presence. For a moment, a hush filled the sept, and Margaery felt the eyes of the realm upon her. She prayed silently that this fragile arrangement would bring peace, not spark fresh conflict. Outside, a small crowd had gathered in the plaza before the great September word spread that the city had a new king. When Margaery led Tommen onto the sept steps, cheers erupted, perhaps more out of hope than genuine devotion, but it was a better reception than Joffrey had ever received. Tommen looked overwhelmed. Margaery whispered, "Wave to them, my king. Smile." He did, giving a shy wave. The cheers grew louder. Margaery raised her own arm, feeling the tension in her chest relax a fraction. A new era was dawning, however tenuous. That evening, a modest feast was held in the Red Keep. Delegations from various regions sat at the high tables, sampling bread, meat, and the last of the autumn wine. Tommen was introduced to each delegate, though the boy mostly nodded politely, while Margaery and Olenna handled the actual conversation. Cersei was conspicuously absent. She had not been permitted to attend, after several outbursts that threatened to spoil the ceremony. Tywin attended but maintained a cool distance, speaking only when necessary. The Tyrell lords, meanwhile, congratulated Margaery, already referring to her as Your Grace with genuine relish. All seemed well on the surface, but Margaery felt the undercurrents. She heard one Stormland's knight mutter that Tommen was no true Baratheon, that the stag sigil was hollow. A Vale lord quietly worried that the Eyrie might soon face demands to swear fealty. A Dornish envoy, a slender woman with a scarf of red and gold, looked upon Tywin with visible distaste. These issues did not vanish with a coronation. Yet at least, for the moment, no swords were drawn. The city had a recognized monarch, and Margaery Tyrell was Queen Regent, the power behind the throne in all but name. When she walked the corridors that night, hearing music drifting from the feast, she realized she had achieved what her original betrothal had never given her: real influence to help shape a kinder, fairer realm. But the Game of Thrones never truly ends. In the days that followed, Margaery grappled with a dozen crises. The finances of the crown were in shambles from the war. Thousands of refugees still crowded the city. Mercenary bands roamed parts of the Stormlands. The Vale's intentions were murky. The Boltons in the north might or might not recognize Tommen. The Greyjoys kept raiding the western coast. Each problem demanded time, coin, or soldiers. She convened frequent councils, ensuring the other lords had a voice. Tywin proved a strangely cooperative presence on the council, offering coldly efficient solutions and rarely pressing the interests of Casterly Rock too hard. Margaery understood that he was playing the long game, hoping to rebuild Lannister fortunes within this new order. For now, they were uneasy partners. Margaery also found herself playing a maternal role for Tommen, helping him with reading lessons, encouraging him to speak confidently in council, reminding him of kindness. He blossomed under her guidance, smiling more than he ever had before. Sometimes he would ask about Joffrey in small, anxious whispers at bedtime. Was he always so angry? Margaery would murmur soothing words, not telling him the full horror. She shielded him from the knowledge that Joffrey had tortured animals for sport, that he had once forced Roast the prostitute to endure unspeakable torment. Let Tommen keep what innocence he could, she thought, until he was older. Perhaps kindness could become the foundation of his reign. She would strive for that. Late one night, as she paced her chambers, she heard a soft knock. She opened the door to find Sansa Stark, face shadowed by the flickering torch. Sansa curtsied slightly. "Forgive me for coming unannounced, my lady," "Or your grace," she amended. "I had a dream, I couldn't sleep. I just needed to talk to someone." Margaery stepped aside, ushering her in. They settled near a small table. Sansa's eyes were red-rimmed. "I dreamt of my family," she said softly. "Of my father, my mother, Robb. They're all gone. The last time I was in these halls, I was betrothed to Joffrey. Then you were betrothed to him. Now he's dead, Tommen's crowned, and the world feels so strange. My mother would have been proud that I survived, but I feel so alone." Gently, Margaery clasped her hand. "You are not alone, Sansa. You have friends here. I would not let any harm come to you. If the realm stabilizes, we can find a safe place for you, or perhaps even reclaim your home in the north someday." A tear slid down Sansa's cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. I'm trying to be brave, but I don't know what the future holds. If the Boltons rule the north, I can never go home." Margaery sighed. "We have no immediate power over the north. But perhaps if we can bring enough of the realm under Tommen's banner, we can challenge the Boltons' hold. We can free the north in time. I promise. I have not forgotten you or your sister." She referenced Arya, who was rumored to be missing. "Until then, stay here. Help me with the city. I need eyes and ears I can trust. We can't rely on Lord Varys for everything." She smiled faintly at that. Sansa nodded, wiping her tears. "Thank you. I will. Whatever I can do." Then she paused, voice trembling. "Is it terrible that I sometimes feel relief that Joffrey is gone? It horrifies me to feel relief about anyone's death." Margaery squeezed her hand again. "No, he was your tormentor. You have the right to feel relief. None of us wanted him dead out of pleasure, but it was necessary. There is no shame in feeling safer now that he can't harm you." Sansa took a shuddering breath, then managed a small, sad smile. "Thank you," she repeated. "You truly are kind, Margaery." She hesitated, then added, "I hope this realm appreciates you, that Tommen appreciates you." Margaery's lips curved, though her eyes remained grave. "I appreciate you, Sansa." They embraced, two young women bound by the traumas of the past year, both survivors of Joffrey's cruelty. After Sansa left, Margaery sat alone for a moment, gazing at the darkness beyond the window. The stars were veiled by clouds. She could hear the faint hum of the city. She wondered what would come next. Stannis? The Targaryen girl rumored to be across the sea with dragons? The Boltons? If winter was truly coming, then all of them might soon be overshadowed by the far northern threat, if the rumors of White Walkers were more than old wives' tales. Still, she could not let fear paralyze her. She had chosen this path when she defied Joffrey. She would walk it with dignity, making the best decisions she could for the realm. Perhaps that was all any ruler could do. In the morning, she rose early to meet with the city's quartermasters, ensuring the next wave of grain shipments were properly accounted for. She oversaw the reorganization of the Goldcloaks into a new city watch loyal to Tommen. She introduced edicts to cap bread prices, punish extortion, and encourage repairs to the city's walls and sewers. Each day, she chaired councils, listening to disputes between lords, forging minor alliances to keep the city from fracturing a guy. And, step by step, she built a foundation, praying it would hold once the harsh winds of winter blew. The gloom that had settled over King's Landing began to lift. Streets grew safer. Merchants returned, lured by the promise of stable markets. The Tyrell presence remained strong, though many soldiers eventually returned to the Reach to manage winter preparations at home. Mace Tyrell left a capable garrison behind, commanded by men loyal to Randyll Tarly and Garland. Ser Loras, after recovering from a slight wound, took charge of Tommen's personal guard, determined to protect the Boy King from any threat. With each passing moon, the city felt more like a functioning capital and less like a war-torn ruin. The transition was not easy. Unrest simmered in pockets, and the memory of the riots was fresh. But the difference was palpable. One crisp morning, Margaery received unexpected visitors. A small delegation from Dorne led by Oberyn Martell himself. They arrived in the city unannounced, their banners fluttering orange and red, stirring alarm among the watchers on the walls. Oberyn, known as the Red Viper, was a man of singular reputation. Lethal, passionate, cunning. He and his retinue were escorted to the Red Keep's Great Hall, where Margaery had assembled her advisors in haste. She greeted Oberyn with composure, though her heart pounded. Dorne had every reason to despise House Lannister, and by extension, the crown that had once sheltered the mountain, Gregor Clegane, who murdered Oberyn's sister Elia. But Gregor Clegane was dead at Tumbleton, shot through by Garland's archers. Perhaps that had changed Oberyn's perspective. Oberyn, tall and lithe, with dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence, bowed to Margaery with elaborate courtesy. "My Queen Regent," he said, "I come bearing cautious tidings from Dorne, and an apology for the late arrival to the coronation. Prince Doran regrets he could not travel, but entrusted me to speak for him." Margaery nodded graciously. "We are honored by your presence, Prince Oberyn. We hope you find the city more welcoming than it was under the previous occupant of the throne." Oberyn's lips curved in a half-smile. "It already smells less like fear, though the stench of old sins lingers." His gaze flicked to Tywin Lannister, who stood stiffly in the background, arms crossed. Tension crackled. Oberyn continued, "I come with a proposition. Dorne has never forgiven the atrocities committed during Robert's rebellion, but we recognize the realm is now in a new chapter. If Tommen is king, and you are his regent, what assurances can you offer us that the old grudges will not be repeated or ignored?" Margaery understood the question's weight. Dorne wanted justice for Elia Martell, for her children, for the savage crimes committed by the Lannisters during the sack of King's Landing. Gregor was dead, but Tywin, who commanded him, still lived. She glanced at Tywin. His face betrayed no sign of guilt. She answered carefully, "We cannot undo the tragedies of the past, Prince Oberyn, but we can promise that justice will be held above all else in this new reign. No man or house is above the law. The city is governed by a council that welcomes the input of all regions. If you wish to press claims or seek redress, we will hear you." Oberyn's eyes gleamed. "And if that redress includes condemnation of those who gave the orders?" Tywin stiffened. Margaery could feel the tension radiating from him, as well as from Randyll Tarly, who recognized how perilous this question was. If Oberyn demanded Tywin's punishment, would that spark a new conflict? Margaery kept her tone measured. Any specific accusations must be brought forward with evidence. The crown will not shield men from crimes proven in a fair trial. We do not repeat the mistakes of the past. The Red Viper turned to Tywin, his voice low and dangerous. "Lord Tywin, are you prepared to face a fair hearing? Should the Martells name you for the crime of ordering Elia's murder?" A murmur rippled through the hall. Tywin's face remained impassive. "I gave no such order. Gregor Clegane acted on his own in the heat of battle. It has always been thus." He paused. "If the new crown calls for a hearing, I will attend. I have nothing to hide." Oberyn studied him, obviously unconvinced, but he smiled coldly. "We shall see." Margaery interposed gently. "Prince Oberyn, you came with a proposition. Please, let us hear it in full. We are open to forging a new friendship with Dorne. The realm needs unity, especially with winter nigh." Oberyn's gaze shifted back to her. "Yes, we would consider acknowledging Tommen's kingship under certain conditions. We want formal recognition of Dornish autonomy in certain matters, our laws, our style of inheritance. We want a seat on the Royal Council to represent Dorne's interests. We also want a formal condemnation of the injustices done to Elia Martell, her children, and all Dornish men and women who suffered." Margaery's pulse fluttered. Some of these demands were not controversial, such as a seat on the council. Dorne's unique inheritance laws had long been tolerated, though not officially endorsed. The formal condemnation of Elia's murder was more delicate, but perhaps it could be done without implicating Tywin by name. Oberyn's demands fell short of calling for Tywin's head, which was a small relief. "We can negotiate these terms," Margaery said. "I believe we can find common ground." Tywin remained silent, possibly unhappy but powerless to override the Queen Regent's approach. If appeasing Dorne prevented further war, Margaery considered it worth the price. Oberyn inclined his head. Then Dorne stands ready to talk. Let us see if these new rulers are truly different from the old. His wry smile suggested he held no illusions, but at least he was willing to try. Over the following weeks, Margaery labored to craft agreements that satisfied Oberyn while not igniting a feud with Tywin. The official condemnation of Elaya's murder was phrased as the vile crime committed upon Elia of House Martell and her children by Ser Gregor Clegane and his accomplices, avoiding direct mention of Tywin's name. It was a delicate dance. Oberyn accepted it for now, though he made it clear that one day he would press the question of who gave the order. Tywin, bitter though he might be, could not openly object. In exchange, the Martells recognized Tommen's legitimacy and pledged to send Dornish troops to defend the realm if threatened by a foreign invasion or if the Boltons in the north rose against the crown. A seat on the small council was granted to Dorne, with Oberyn temporarily filling it until Prince Doran could send a permanent envoy. A measure of cooperation, tenuous but real, blossomed between the desert land and the new regime in King's Landing. This pattern repeated itself in other matters. As the months ticked by, Margaery realized her regency was an ongoing balancing act. Every great house had demands, every region had grudges, and she had to navigate them all, mindful that her authority was new and not yet unassailable. She drew upon Olenna's sharp insights, Tarly's disciplined approach, and even Tywin's strategic mind. Slowly, she built alliances, offered trade benefits to the Vale, negotiated with the Riverlands lords to quell Frey aggression. The north remained beyond her immediate reach, but through Sansa, she tried to gather information about any pockets of Stark loyalists. If the day came that the Boltons needed to be confronted, Margaery wanted to do so with as much legitimacy and backing as possible. In the midst of these labors, Tommen grew. His face thinned slightly, losing some of its babyish roundness. He studied reading and writing with Maester Balabar, who replaced Pycelle after the old man's death by a sudden seizure. He practiced swordplay with Loras Tyrell in the courtyard, though he much preferred playing with kittens. Sometimes, Margaery would find him sprawled on the floor with a ginger cat, ignoring a stack of reading that needed to be done. She would kneel beside him, reminding him gently that a king must be learned, that he must understand his own laws. He would sigh but comply. She felt a mixture of affection and resolve to see him ready for the trials that inevitably awaited. Though Tommen might be crowned, the realm was too fractious to let him remain a carefree child. He had to become a king. One day, she took Tommen to observe the royal court in session, letting him watch as minor lords came to petition for tax relief or to settle disputes. After a particularly heated argument between two lesser houses, Tommen tugged on Margaery's sleeve. Why do they argue so much over farmland boundaries? Can't they just share? She smiled and explained how farmland was wealth, how every inch could mean feeding one's people. He frowned but nodded, a thoughtful look in his young eyes. She hoped that spark of empathy would stay with him. The city itself changed under her regency. More buildings were repaired, the blackened ruins from the riots cleared away. The markets bustled with commerce, though the threat of winter kept prices high. Refugees found modest work. Margaery encouraged a wave of architectural improvements, clearing out some of the worst slums to build safer housing. She also oversaw the cleaning of the city's water wells, an unglamorous but crucial task that reduced disease. Bit by bit, she strove to prove that King's Landing could be governed with an eye toward the common folk, not just the lords. Some sneered that it was a naive approach, but the city's morale improved. More and more, people called her the People's Queen, though she still technically held only the title of Queen Regent. Amid all of this, she rarely had time to reflect on her own life. She was unmarried, no immediate talk of a new husband, though some lords dropped hints that she might one day marry Tommen when he was older, to secure her place as queen. That was a subject Margaery and Olenna sidestepped for now, given Tommen was only 9. And Margaery, for her part, felt no rush to be a wife again. She had far too much on her plate. Her nights were often spent poring over ledgers or meeting with advisors. Sometimes she would slip into the gardens of the Red Keep, seeking a moment of quiet among the hedges and the newly planted roses. She missed Highgarden's sweet air, the soft murmur of the Mander's waters. But this was her duty, her choice. She would not turn away now. In a quiet, moonlit stroll through the courtyard, she found herself thinking back to that crucial moment when she refused to marry Joffrey in front of the entire court. How terrifying it had been, how uncertain. She had taken a leap that might have spelled doom for House Tyrell. Instead, it led to a monumental shift in the realm's power. The wars that followed had been terrible, but in the end, a monstrous king was gone, and a gentler boy now sat the throne. Margaery felt no triumph in Joffrey's death, only relief. But she also felt a kind of awe at how a single act of defiance had changed the course of so many lives. The cost was high, but perhaps the reward, a realm that might know peace, was worth it. Night's chill deepened. She drew her cloak around her shoulders, gazing at the moon above. In the distance, King's Landing sprawled like a slumbering beast, torches winking in scattered squares. Faint singing from a tavern drifted on the breeze. Margaery closed her eyes, breathing in the cool air. She could almost smell the distant fragrance of flowers. Perhaps it was just her memory playing tricks, reminding her of Highgarden. But in that moment, she felt something akin to hope settle into her bones. The realm was still fraught with dangers. Rebellious lords, winter's approach, the uncertain fates of the north and beyond. But King's Landing itself was healing, and a kinder king reigned. She resolved to keep guiding him, to keep forging alliances, to keep the city fed and safe. Whatever storms came, she would face them with the resilience she had found within herself since the day she refused that monstrous wedding. If there was one truth she had learned in this endless game, it was that peace was never permanent, and power was never absolute. Yet with enough will, with enough wisdom and compassion, a ruler could at least steer the realm away from the worst brink. Margaery intended to do exactly that. She whispered into the night's silence, "For the people, for the realm, let this fragile peace take root." In the days and months ahead, she would see how that root sprouted under the frost of winter, how she might cultivate alliances to stave off new threats. And though the board might shift again, though new players might emerge, Stannis, Daenerys Targaryen, the Boltons, the Ironborn, Margaery Tyrell, Queen Regent of Westeros, would not be easily bowed. Her refusal to wed Joffrey had sown the seeds of a new era, and now she would see them grow, thorns and all. If the day ever came that war flared again, at least the realm would remember this moment of relative calm. A calm won by a woman's daring choice to defy a cruel king and claim her own destiny. In the far north, storms gathered beyond the wall, but that was a story for another time. For now, in King's Landing, the bells chimed softly in the evening breeze, echoing across streets that no longer cowered beneath a tyrant's shadow. The boy King Tommen slept in the Red Keep, safe for the moment, while Margaery Tyrell walked the halls with measured steps, a living testament to the power of a single refusal, and the grand tapestry of consequences it could weave throughout the Seven Kingdoms.